Tonight, we're diving into a tender what-if from the wizarding world. The long, quiet story of a friendship that once broke on a single cruel word, and the gentle life that might have grown had it never broken at all. Imagine two lonely children in a gray mill town, Severus Snape and Lily Evans, who found in each other someone who understood. And imagine that instead of losing her. Severus kept her friendship and let her steady light draw him away from the darkness he was tempted toward. Imagine a boy who chose love over power and a life the two of them built together, quiet and unexpected and whole. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to solve and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady telling meant to carry you toward rest. Over the next 20 chapters, we will follow a friendship that held, a heart turned from the dark, and a long, ordinary happiness that neither of them ever thought they would have. You do not need to remember any of it, and you do not need to hold on. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down towards sleep. Long before there was a castle, long before there were owls at the window or letters sealed in green ink, there was a gray town called Cokeworth, and in that town there were two children who had not yet met. The town sat low along a slow brown river, and a great mill rose at its heart, and the chimney of that mill breathed a thin ribbon of smoke into the sky at all hours, so that the light over Cokeworth always seemed a little softened, a little used, as though the sun itself had grown tired of shining on the rows of narrow brick houses. It was not an ugly place, though many who lived there called it so. It was only a quiet place, a working place, where the days were long and the pleasures were small, and where a lonely child might grow up believing that the whole world was made of the same gray brick and the same gray water. In one of those narrow houses, on a mean little street called Spinner's End, there lived a boy named Severus Snape. He was a thin child with sallow skin and a curtain of black hair that fell across his eyes, and clothes that never quite fit him, for they were cast-offs and mendings, too large in one place and too short in another. His home was not a warm one. There was a hardness in that house, a tension that hung in the rooms like the smell of coal, and the boy learned early to be quiet, to make himself small, to slip out of doors and away toward the river when the voices behind him rose. He was a strange child, and he knew it, and the other children of Cokeworth knew it too, and kept their distance from him. But Severus carried a secret that made his loneliness bearable, a secret he hugged to himself in the long gray afternoons. He knew that he was not ordinary. He knew that there was magic in him, real magic, the kind that could make a fallen leaf spin without any wind, the kind that could send a hidden thrill up his arm when he wished for a thing hard enough. He did not fully understand it, but he knew it was there, and he knew it made him different, and in his loneliest hours, it was the one bright thing he owned. Not far from Spinner's End, in a kinder house on a kinder street, there lived a girl named Lily Evans. She was everything the boy was not. Where he was shadowed, she was bright. Where he was watchful, she was open. She had dark red hair that caught what little sun the town offered, and green eyes that seemed always on the edge of laughter, and a way of moving through the world that made other people glad to be near her. She had a sister too, an older girl named Petunia, thin and particular and proud, and the two sisters were close in the way of children who have only each other for company on the long walks to the park and the longer walks home. Lily was loved in her house, and she loved in return easily, and yet there was in her, even so young, a thing she could not explain to anyone, not even to Petunia. For Lily, too, was not ordinary. When she leapt from a swing, she seemed to hang a heartbeat too long in the air. When she cupped a flower in her palms, it would open and close, its petals breathing to the rhythm of her wonder. She did not know what these things meant. She only knew that they frightened her sister, and so she learned, as children do, to be careful when she showed them. It was the river and the little wood beside it that brought the two of them together, for it was there that the boy watched the girl, unseen, for many long afternoons before he ever found the courage to speak. He had noticed her doing the impossible. He had seen the flower breathe in her hands, and to Severus, hidden in the shadow of the trees, it was as though he had found, at long last, proof that he was not alone in the world. Here was another one. Here was someone made of the same secret stuff as himself. He watched her the way a thirsty person watches water, half in longing and half in fear, and when at last he stepped out from behind the leaves to tell her the great thing he knew, the thing he had never been able to say to anyone, his voice came out wrong and eager and too quick, and he frightened her at first, and she ran. But the wonderful thing about Lily Evans was that she came back. She was curious as much as she was cautious, and the boy had said a word to her that she could not forget, a word that seemed to unlock a door she had not known was locked. He had told her that she was a witch. He had told her that the strange things she could do had a name, and that they were not a flaw in her, but a gift, and that somewhere beyond the gray chimneys of Hogwarts there was a whole world where people like the two of them belonged. To a child who had begun to fear she was broken, these were the most precious words she had ever heard. And so she sought the strange boy out again, by the river, among the trees, and little by little, afternoon by afternoon, a friendship began to grow between them. They were an unlikely pair, and they knew it, and it did not matter. Severus told her everything he had gathered about the hidden world, half of it true, and half of it the tangled half-knowledge of a lonely boy who had listened at doors. He told her of a school called Hogwarts, a castle where children like them learned to master their gifts. He told her of the ministry that governed their kind, and of the strange long history of witches and wizards, and Lily drank it all in with shining eyes. And in return, she gave him something he had never had, which was her company freely given, her laughter, her warmth, the simple, ordinary miracle of being wanted by another person. They lay in the long grass and talked of the life that waited for them. They quarreled sometimes, as children do, and made it up again by the next afternoon. He showed her small magics, and she showed him how to be glad. They gathered smooth stones from the shallows and set them in rows along the bank, and they watched the slow brown water carry leaves out of sight around the bend, and they told each other, over and over, all the things they hoped the hidden world would be. Two outsiders, each of whom had believed themselves the only one of their kind, had found in each other a mirror and a friend. And the gray town did not seem so gray when they were together in it. The mill still breathed its ribbon of smoke, and the houses still stood in their long, tired rows. But the river held a different light now, because two children who had thought themselves alone had learned that they were not. Neither of them could have known, in those first golden summers by the water, how much would one day hang upon this friendship. Neither could have guessed that the world beyond Hogwarts held both wonders and terrors, or that the two of them would one day stand at crossroads where a single word, a single choice, might send their whole lives spinning down one path or another. For now, they were only children, a boy and a girl in the long light of a slow summer, sharing a secret too large for either of them to hold alone. For now, it was enough that they had found each other. For now, it was enough that neither one was lonely anymore. Up next in Chapter 2, The Word That Was Never Said, we'll come to the fragile hinge on which their whole friendship once turned, and see how, in this gentler telling, a moment of cruelty is caught and softened before it can ever do its harm. Every friendship, if it lasts long enough, comes at last to a moment where it might break. It is not always a great betrayal that does the breaking. More often it is something small, a word spoken in a bad hour, a hurt landed where the skin is thinnest, a single careless cruelty that arrives at exactly the wrong time and puts a crack through something that had seemed unbreakable. In the true and sorrowful telling of Severus and Lily, there was such a moment and such a word, and it broke a friendship that neither of them ever fully mended. But this is not that telling. This is the gentler one, the one that might have been, and so tonight we come to the hinge of the whole story and watch it turn a different way. By the time the two of them had grown into their school years, the world had begun to press upon their friendship in ways it had never done beside the river in Cokeworth. Severus had fallen in with a certain company, older Slytherin boys with cold eyes and clever tongues, boys who spoke of blood and worth, and who talked as though the world could be sorted into those who mattered and those who did not. He did not believe all of it, not truly, not in the deepest part of himself, but he was a boy who had been given so little that the promise of belonging was a powerful thing, and the company flattered him, and he began to wear their manner as a boy wears a coat too big for him, hoping to grow into it. And on the other side stood James Potter and his friends, quick and golden and sure of themselves, who had made a sport of tormenting Severus, and who never let him forget how little he was thought of. Between these two pressures, the boy grew raw and defensive, quick to wound because he had so often been wounded, and there came a day when all of that rawness gathered itself into a single terrible instant. It happened by the lake, after an examination, in the heat of a public humiliation. James and his friends had set upon Severus before a watching crowd, had turned him upside down in the air, had stripped him of his dignity in the cruelest and most casual way, and Lily had come running to his defense, as she always did, placing herself between her oldest friend and the boys who mocked him. And in that moment, Severus, hanging shamed and furious in the air, his pride in ruins and his heart a storm, felt the old ugly word rise in his throat. It was a word he had heard the cold Slytherin boys use, a word that reduced a witch like Lily to something less than herself, a word that carried in it every poison he had ever half swallowed. And it rose, and it reached the very edge of his tongue, ready to be flung at the one person in all the world who had never once failed him. But here, in this telling, something stopped him. Perhaps it was the sight of her face, her green eyes fixed on him, not in mockery but in worry, defending him still even as the crowd laughed. Perhaps it was the sudden, clear knowledge, arriving in him like cold water, of exactly what that word would cost, and exactly who he would be if he said it. Perhaps it was only that beneath all the borrowed hardness he was still, at his core, the lonely boy from the river who had found in this girl the single good thing his life had given him. Whatever it was, it caught him. The word died in his throat before it was ever born. He shut his mouth on it, hard, and swallowed it down. And though his eyes still burned and his face still flamed with shame, he did not say the thing that could never be unsaid. And that swallowing, that small and enormous act of a boy choosing in an instant to be better than his worst moment, was the whole hinge of the story, and it turned the gentle way. What passed between them afterward was quiet, and it was not easy, for shame is a heavy thing to carry, and Severus carried it heavily. When the crowd had gone and the two of them stood alone, he could not at first meet her eyes. He knew what he had almost done. He knew the shape of the word he had almost thrown, and he was sickened by how close it had come, by the fact that he had held it in his mouth at all. And Lily, who was wiser than her years, saw all of this in his face. She saw the borrowed cruelty of the company he kept, and she saw beneath it the frightened boy who was drowning in it. And she made in that moment a choice of her own, a choice as quiet and as large as his. She could have turned away. She could have decided that a boy who kept such company and nearly spoke such words was not a boy worth keeping. Many would have. Instead, she chose understanding over anger. She chose to believe in the one who had swallowed the word rather than to condemn him for having tasted it. She did not pretend that nothing had happened, for that was not her way, and it would have helped neither of them. She told him plainly, in her steady manner, what she feared for him, and what she saw in the friends he had taken, and what she would not stand to watch him become. She did not preach, and she did not scold. She only told him the truth, that she loved him as her oldest friend, and that she could not bear to lose him to a coldness that was not really his own. She reminded him, gently, of the river and the long grass and the two children who had found each other there, and she asked him, without asking, whether that boy was still somewhere inside the one who kept such company now. And Severus, who had braced himself for her scorn and found instead her sorrow, was undone by it. For scorn he could have borne. He had borne scorn all his life. He had built his whole guarded self around the expectation of being thought little of, and he had 100 answers ready for contempt. But her sorrow, her stubborn refusal to give up on him, went past all his defenses and touched the boy beneath. And something in him that had been hardening for years began, very slowly, to soften. He had no answer ready for kindness. He never had, and so the thing that broke the friendship in the true tale did not break it here. The two of them walked back toward the castle together in the failing light, not quite as they had been, for something had shifted, but still together, still bound. Something had been tested that day and had held. And the strange truth of it was that the friendship came out of the testing not weaker, but stronger. The way a bone that has been strained and allowed to knit can grow tougher than it was before. Severus knew now, with a certainty he had never had, exactly how far he was willing to go and exactly where he would stop. And Lily knew, with a certainty of her own, that the boy she had befriended by the river was still there beneath everything, worth defending and worth keeping. The word had never been said. The forgiveness had come at once, unasked and freely given. And the door that in another life slammed shut forever stayed, in this one, quietly open. Small things turn great ones, and a single instant of restraint, a single word swallowed instead of spoken, had kept a whole life from breaking apart before it had even begun. Up next, in Chapter 3, A Friendship That Held, we'll follow the two of them forward through the long years of school and watch how a bond that survived its hardest moment learned to endure all the smaller pressures that came after. A friendship is not made in a single moment, however important that moment may be. It is made in the long, slow accumulation of ordinary days, in the 1,000 small kindnesses and small forgivenesses that pass between two people who have decided, without ever quite saying so, that they will keep each other. And so, having survived the hardest hour, the friendship of Severus and Lily settled into the long endurance of the school years. And it is that endurance we come to tonight. The quiet, steady holding of a bond through all the seasons that might have worn it away. Hogwarts was vast, and it was full of currents that pulled the two of them in different directions. There were the walls of the houses themselves, which sorted the students into separate towers and separate tables and separate loyalties. There were the friendships each of them made apart from the other, the girls Lily laughed with in Gryffindor, the boys Severus studied beside in the dungeons. There were the crowded corridors and the packed classrooms. endless small business of being young in a great school, all of it conspiring to keep two friends busy and turned toward their own concerns. And yet, through all of it, term after term, the two of them found each other. They met in the library between the tall shelves, where the light fell green through high windows, and where a whispered conversation could pass unnoticed. They met by the lake on the fine days, and in the courtyards, and in the quiet hours after supper, when the castle began to still. They fell into small habits that were theirs alone. A particular window seat, a particular hour, a particular corner of the grounds where the two houses did not think to look for either of them. Wherever the pressures of the school tried to part them, they made their small, deliberate space to be together, and they kept it, and the keeping of it became one of the quiet rhythms of their days. It was not always easy, and it was not always smooth. There were stretches when Severus grew distant and guarded, when the old bitterness rose in him, and he pulled away into himself, and Lily learned when to press and when to wait. There were stretches when Lily's world was full and bright and busy, when she was pulled a dozen ways by the ordinary popularity of a girl who was easy to love, and Severus learned, though it cost his pride, not to grudge her the warmth she gave to others. They quarreled sometimes still, as they had by the river, over things large and small, over the friends he kept and the friends she kept, over words said carelessly and taken hard. But they had learned the great secret that many never learn, which is that a quarrel need not be the end of anything, that two people who trust each other can be angry and still be bound, can disagree and still return. And so their disagreements, when they came, were like weather passing over a settled land, and the land remained. What steadied Severus most in those years was the simple constancy of her loyalty. He had grown up expecting to be abandoned, had learned to read the small signs of a person's patience running out, had braced himself all his life for the moment when whoever he cared for would finally decide he was too much trouble to keep. And Lily never gave him that moment. She was there in the autumn, and she was there in the spring. She was there when he was easy to be near, and she was there when he was not. And slowly, over the long accumulation of her staying, something in Severus that had never quite believed in permanence began to believe in it. He began to walk a little straighter. He grew less quick to expect the worst of people, because one person, at least, had never given him the worst. The friendship did not remake him all at once, for people are not remade all at once, but it held him steady while he grew, the way a stake holds a young tree steady in the wind until its own roots are strong enough, and under its quiet influence, the sharpest of his edges began, slowly, to wear smooth. And Lily, for her part, was warmed by him in a way that none of her other friendships could quite match. For all the people who loved her, and there were many, there was only one who had known her longest, only one who had been there at the very beginning, by the river, before Hogwarts, before any of it. Severus had known her when she was only a frightened girl who could make flowers breathe and did not know why. He had given her the first true name for what she was, and that shared beginning was a thing no later friendship could equal, a root that went down deeper than all the rest. When the world grew loud around her, when the ordinary troubles of growing up pressed close, there was a particular rest she found in his company that she found nowhere else. The ease of being with someone who required no explaining, who had seen her from the start and stayed. He was not always cheerful company, and he was not always gentle, but he was hers in a way that was older than everything, and she treasured it. There were those who did not understand the friendship and who said so. There were Gryffindors who could not fathom why bright, warm Lily kept company with the strange, shadowed Slytherin boy, and there were Slytherins who sneered at Severus for keeping company with a Muggle-born girl. The two houses looked on with equal puzzlement, and now and then with open disapproval. And the pressure of that disapproval was real and constant and wearing. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to let it win, to let the friendship quietly lapse under the steady weight of what everyone seemed to expect, to drift apart by slow degrees until one day they simply were not friends anymore, without anyone ever having decided it. That is how most childhood friendships end, not with a break, but with a fading. And it did not happen to them. It did not happen because both of them, in their different ways, refused to let it, kept choosing the friendship over the ease of letting it go, kept turning back toward each other when the world tried to turn them away. By the time the middle school years had passed into the later ones, the friendship had become a settled fact of both their lives, so woven into the fabric of each of them that neither could quite imagine the world without the other in it. It was not a dramatic thing. It made no great show. It was simply there, dependable as the seasons. A low, steady warmth that each of them carried through the long stone corridors and the long, dark winters of the north. They had come a great distance from the two lonely children by the river, and yet in the deepest way they were still those children, still the pair who had found each other when each had believed themselves alone. The years had changed their faces and their heights and the depth of what they knew, but they had not changed the root of the thing, and the root held everything else. The friendship had held. Through the pull of the houses and the pressure of the disapproving, through quarrels and distances and all the ordinary erosions of time, it had held. And a thing that holds through so much, through years and houses and all the slow erosions of time, begins at last to seem as though it might hold through anything at all. Up next in Chapter 4, the sorting that divided them and the bond that did not break, we'll go back to the very night the castle first set them on opposite sides, and see how a friendship that began in one gray town learned to live in two separate worlds beneath a single roof. To understand how their friendship learned to live in two worlds, we must go back before the quarrels and the crossroads, back to the very first night the castle took hold of their lives, the night of the sorting, for it was then, on their very first evening within those ancient walls, that Hogwarts reached out and set the two of them on opposite sides of a line that would run through all their years to come. And it was then that the friendship faced a threat quieter and deeper than any single cruel word could ever be. The journey there had been a wonder to them both. They had ridden the scarlet train north together through a changing land, watching the gray towns give way to green hills and the green hills to wild, dark country. And they had talked the whole long way of the castle, waiting at the end of the line and of the houses they would join. Severus had spoken of Slytherin with a particular hunger, for it was the house of the ambitious and the clever, the house that promised a boy who had been given nothing a place among those who intended to matter. He had hoped aloud that they would be sorted together, the two of them, into whatever house would have them both. And Lily had hoped it too, in her open way, though she cared less which house it was than that it would be theirs together. Neither of them, in the warm rocking of the train, had truly let themselves imagine that the castle might divide them. But divide them it did. In the great hall, beneath the enchanted ceiling that showed the same starry sky as the night outside, the students were called forward one by one to sit upon a stool and wear an ancient patched hat, and the hat looked into each of them and named the house where each belonged. And when Severus took his turn, the hat had barely touched his black hair before it named him for Slytherin, and the long table beneath the green banners welcomed him with its cool applause. And when Lily took her turn, the hat considered her a moment longer, and then named her for Gryffindor, and the table beneath the scarlet and gold roared its welcome, and she rose and went to it. Severus had watched her walk to the far table with a feeling he could not name, half joy that she had found her place, and half a small cold fear that her place was not his. And Lily, settling among her cheering new housemates, had turned her head at once to find him across the crowded hall, and their eyes had met over the length of it, and each had given the other a small, steadying look that said, without any words, that the distance of a great hall was not so very great after all. And so it was done, in the space of a few short minutes, on their very first night. The two children of Cokeworth, who had crossed the whole of the country side by side, were sent to opposite ends of the same great hall, to different tables in different towers, to houses that had eyed each other with suspicion for 1,000 years. It was a hard thing, and neither of them pretended otherwise. There was a real grief in it, sharp and childish and true. The grief of two friends discovering that the world had rules older than their friendship, and did not intend to bend them. From that first night forward, they slept in different quarters, one high in a tower, and one deep beneath the lake, and they woke among different companions and ate at different tables, and were shaped, day, by different loyalties and different pride. The two houses were not merely separate. They were, by long tradition, rivals, and something more than rivals, and a friendship that reached across the gulf between them was a strange and difficult thing. A small boat rowing forever against a current that wished to carry the two banks apart. Every day the castle itself, with its houses and its points and its ancient enmities, seemed to lean gently on their friendship, asking it to give way. And here was the tenderness of it, the thing that made their bond remarkable. It did not give way. Where another pair might have let the sorting decide their friendship for them, might have accepted the verdict of the hat as a verdict on their whole future, and drifted apart into their separate houses, Severus and Lily quietly refused. They had, after all, already been divided once, by the accident of birth into a world that had no place for their kind of magic. And they had reached across that divide and found each other. They had grown up as outsiders in the Muggle town, two children who did not fit the world around them, and now they were outsiders again, each in their own way. A Gryffindor who kept a Slytherin friend, and a Slytherin who kept a Gryffindor one, each stepping a little outside the neat expectations of their house for the sake of the other. Being an outsider was the oldest and most familiar thing in the world to both of them. They knew how to live at the edge of things. They had done it all their lives. And so they made, in the great divided castle, a small private country of two, a friendship that belonged to neither house and answered to neither, and they defended it quietly, day after day, against everything that pulled at it. They learned the geography of a friendship lived between worlds. They learned which corridors lay on the neutral ground between the towers and the dungeons, and which hours of the day belonged to no house in particular, and where a Gryffindor and a Slytherin might sit together without drawing every eye. They learned to carry their friendship lightly in the crowded places, and to let it open fully in the quiet ones. There was the wide staircase that neither house claimed, and the far end of the library where the older books gathered dust, and a certain stretch of the grounds down by the water where the wind kept most people away. In these in-between places they built the ordinary business of their friendship, and they grew skilled at finding them, until the whole great castle held a second hidden map that only the two of them could read. And in this way, the difficulty itself became, strangely, a kind of tenderness, for a thing defended is a thing loved, and every small effort it took to keep the friendship alive across the divide was a small proof of how much each of them valued it. The very obstacles that might have ended a shallower bond only deepened this one, because the two of them had to choose it again each day, and each day they did. There were times when the division reached inward and grew painful, when the ideas of Severus's house and the loyalties of Lily's threatened to become ideas and loyalties within the two friends themselves, and those were the hardest passages of all. and we will come to them in their turn. But even in the hardest of them, the memory of that first night held them fast. The memory of two children divided by a hat and refusing, at once and forever, to be divided in their hearts. The sorting had drawn a line through their lives. It had given them two houses, two worlds, two futures that pointed in different directions. And still, across that line, term after term and year after year, they kept reaching for each other, and the bond did not break. It bent, and it strained, and it ached at times, but it did not break, because they would not let it, and because some friendships, the truest ones, are stronger than the walls that are built to keep them apart. Up next in Chapter 5, Severus at a Crossroads, will follow the young Slytherin to the very edge of a darker path and see the two things that pulled at him there: the promise of power on the one side and, on the other, the one person he could not bring himself to lose. By his 5th year at Hogwarts, Severus Snape had come to a place in his life where two roads lay open before him, and he could feel, in the quiet way that a young person feels such things without quite having words for them, that the choosing of one over the other would decide everything. He was clever in a way that the castle noticed. His potions were the envy of older students, his mind for spells sharp and hungry, and among the Slytherins there were those who saw in him a promising thing, a boy who could be shaped and used and welcomed if only he leaned the right way. They did not press him openly. They did it in the soft, patient manner of people who are certain of their cause. They spoke of blood and of purity, of the old families and their rightful place, and they made these ideas sound like knowledge rather than cruelty, like a door being opened rather than a cage being built. For a lonely boy from a poor house in a gray mill town, the pull of that company was not a small thing, and it would be unkind to pretend otherwise. Severus had grown up with little. He had known the sting of being looked down upon, the shabbiness of his robes, the whispers about where he came from and what his father was. And here, in the low green light of the Slytherin common room, were older students who told him that he was not less than the others, but more, that his gifts marked him for something, that there was a circle he might belong to where his cleverness would be prized and his hurts would be answered. The dark ideas came wrapped in the promise of belonging, and belonging was the thing he had wanted most for as long as he could remember. It is an old truth, and a gentle one to remember, that the roads toward bitterness are almost never chosen for the bitterness itself. They are chosen for the warmth that seems to wait at the end of them. So the pull was real, and the temptation of power was real, and on many an evening Severus sat among that company and felt himself lean toward it, felt the ideas settle into him like cold water finding the low places in a field. He listened to talk of the sort of wizard who was rising in the wider world, a wizard whose name the older students spoke with a hush that was half fear and half worship. And he understood, without being told plainly, that there was a path that led from this common room out into that man's service, and that walking it would give a boy like him a kind of importance he had never tasted. The path shimmered. It offered to answer every old ache at once, to turn the small, mistreated boy into someone before whom others would grow quiet. And yet there was a counterweight, and the counterweight had a name, and the name was Lily. For all the pull of that dark and shimmering road, Severus knew, in the deepest and least clever part of himself, that he could not walk far along it and keep her. He did not need anyone to explain this to him. He had seen the way her face changed when the talk turned cruel, the small, careful sorrow that came into her eyes when someone near him spoke of muggle-born witches and wizards as though they were something lesser. He had watched her go quiet, and he had felt, in those moments, a shame that no promise of power could quite reach. Lily was Muggle-born herself. Every ugly word about blood was in the end a word about her. And every time he let such a word pass without flinching, he felt her slipping a little further from him, like a boat easing out from a shore he was standing on. That was the crossroads then, and it was not a loud or dramatic thing. It was quiet, the way the most important choices usually are. On the one side lay the company of Slytherin, the flattering older boys, the ideas that made his griefs feel like a kind of superiority, and beyond them the far bright lure of real power in a darkening world. On the other side lay a single friend. Not a crowd, not a cause, not a promise of greatness. Only one girl with dark red hair and kind green eyes, who had known him since before either of them understood what they were, who had walked with him by the river in the long, slow summers of childhood, who had believed he was worth knowing when no one else had bothered to look. And the strange arithmetic of his heart, which he could not have explained to anyone and did not try to, kept coming out the same way. The crowd weighed less than the one. It would be too simple to say that he chose easily, because he did not. There were nights when the resentment in him rose up and made the dark road look like justice. When the boys who tormented him in the corridors, the ones who hexed him for sport and laughed while they did it, made the whole Muggle-born and half-blood world seem like something he owed no kindness to. In those hours, the ideas of purity felt almost sweet, a way of turning his pain outward instead of letting it eat him from within. He was 15, and he was hurting, and hurting people reach for whatever makes the hurting feel like strength. None of that is hard to understand, and none of it makes him a monster. It only makes him a boy standing where a great many people have stood, at the meeting of two roads, with the wind of an easier bitterness at his back. But every time he reached the edge of that easier road, something held him. He would catch himself, some small, honest part of him rising up to say that if he went that way, he would have to become the sort of person Lily could not love. And that he did not want to be that person, not truly, not underneath the anger. The image of losing her was worse than the image of being small. He had already tasted, in a single terrible near miss earlier in their friendship, what it might feel like to hurt her and drive her away, and the memory of that fear had never quite left him. It had planted in him a caution, a tenderness, a habit of drawing back at the last moment. And so, again and again, at the crossroads, he did not walk into the dark. He turned, instead, toward the friend who was waiting, and each turning made the next one a little more natural, until the shape of the choice was slowly, quietly becoming the shape of the man he would be. None of this was settled yet. The pull remained, and the older Slytherins had not given up on him, and the dark road still shimmered on the far side of many an evening. But the counterweight held, night after night, held by nothing more than the simple weight of one loyal friendship that he was not willing to spend. He was a boy at a crossroads, and the wonder of it, the thing that made all the difference, was that he had someone standing at the better fork, not pulling at him, not lecturing him, only being there, steady and unafraid, so that whenever he looked up from the dark, he saw her light instead. And a person can walk a long way toward goodness on nothing more than that. On the knowledge that there is someone worth turning back for. He did not name it to himself in those words, of course. He was too young and too guarded for that kind of clarity, and boys who have been hurt rarely trust the softest truths inside them. But some quiet part of him kept the account faithfully, and the account always balanced the same way, and so, evening after evening, he stayed on the side of the fork where her light fell. Up next in Chapter 6, Lily's steady light will settle into the quiet way she drew him gently from the dark, not with argument or reproach, but simply by being good. And see how one person's ordinary kindness can become the surest anchor another soul ever finds. If you had asked Lily Evans whether she was trying to save Severus Snape from anything, she would not have understood the question. And that not understanding was the very heart of her power over his life. She did not think of herself as rescuing him. She did not preach at him, or set herself up as his conscience, or lecture him about the company he kept, though she noticed that company and quietly disliked it. She simply went on being who she had always been, and it turned out that who she had always been was exactly the thing that could draw a darkening boy back into the light. Her goodness was not a strategy. It was a temperature, a warmth she gave off without effort, and Severus, half frozen by the coldness of the ideas around him, kept coming near it because it was the warmest thing he knew. She was good in small ways, and it was the smallness of it that made it real. When a younger student was crying in a corridor, Lily stopped where others walked on. When someone was left out, she made a place for them without any show of doing it. She was kind to the house elves who cleared the tables, kind to the portraits, kind to the sad and the strange and the overlooked. And she was kind not because she had decided kindness was correct, but because unkindness genuinely puzzled her, as though it were a needless expense of energy that no one had ever explained the point of. Severus watched all of this. He watched it the way a person raised in a cold house watches someone tend a fire, half in longing and half in disbelief that it can be done so simply. And here was the thing that undid, slowly, the dark ideas that had been offered to him. Those ideas rested on a single hidden assumption, which was that kindness is weakness, that gentleness is what small people do because they lack the strength to be cruel, and that the truly powerful take what they want and answer to no one. Severus had half believed this. The older Slytherins believed it entirely, and they made it sound like wisdom. But Lily was living proof against it, and she proved it not by arguing, but simply by existing in front of him, day after day. She was not weak. Anyone who mistook her softness for weakness learned quickly, and to their cost, that she had a temper like a struck match and a spine that did not bend. She was brave. She stood up to older students, to unfairness, to cruelty, and she did it without ever becoming cruel herself. And so, without a single lecture, she disproved the whole quiet philosophy that had been poured into Severus. Because here was a person who was both kind and strong, both gentle and unafraid, and the two things in her were not at war, but were, plainly, the same thing seen from different sides. He could not hold the dark ideas and hold her friendship in the same hands for very long. The ideas told him that people like Lily were lesser, and Lily herself, standing there being braver and truer and more alive than anyone in the green-lit common room, made the ideas look not evil so much as stupid. And stupidity was the one thing Severus could not bear to be caught believing. His pride, which had so nearly led him into the dark, became instead a thread that led him out of it, because he was too clever, in the end, to keep believing something that the evidence of his own dearest friend contradicted every single day. She unmade the lie simply by being unmistakably real. There was tenderness in the way she did it, too, and this mattered more than any argument could have. She never made him feel that he was a project, never let him see her worrying over his soul, never gave him the humiliation of being someone else's charity case. When they were together, she treated him as she always had, as her oldest friend, the boy from the riverbank, the one who had first told her what she was. She teased him and laughed with him and shared her sweets and her secrets. And in doing so, she reminded him, without ever saying it, of a self that existed underneath the resentment. A self that had been happy once and could be happy again. The bitter, guarded boy that Slytherin was trying to grow, and the ordinary, warm boy that Lily remembered, could not both be true. And every hour he spent in her steady company tipped the balance a little further toward the one she saw. She did this without ever seeming to work at it, which was the greatest part of its power. For a kindness that announces itself can be resisted, while a kindness that is simply the ordinary weather of a person cannot be argued with at all. He could dispute a lecture. He could not dispute the plain daily fact of her. And so the fact of her did what no lecture ever could, wearing the hardness out of him one unremarkable afternoon at a time. It is a quiet kind of miracle, the way one good person can hold another in place. Lily did not have to do anything grand. She only had to keep being reliably, unshowily good, and to keep including him in that goodness. And the mere fact of it worked on him like water on stone, slowly wearing away the sharp, bitter edges, slowly smoothing the places where cruelty had tried to take hold. When the anger rose in him, and it still did, it would meet the memory of her, and the memory would gentle it. When the dark company offered him their belonging, the offer would be weighed against the simpler belonging he already had, the one that asked nothing of him but that he stay himself, and it would be found wanting. She was the fixed point his compass kept swinging back toward, and she did not even know she was doing it. There were evenings, in those years, when the two of them would sit together in some forgotten corner of the castle, by a window or on a stair, not doing anything in particular, and Severus would feel the whole weight of the day loosen in him. The corridors could be cruel. The older boys could whisper their ideas. The world could press its cold philosophies against him. But here, beside her, none of it could reach all the way in. She was a kind of shelter, and the strange thing about the shelter was that it was made of nothing but ordinary decency. A boy who had grown up with very little warmth had found, at last, a place that was warm, and the place was simply another person, and he had only to sit near her to feel the cold lift. She had built it out of small kindnesses accumulated over years, the way a nest is built out of 1,000 unremarkable twigs. And now, it was strong enough to hold a boy who might otherwise have been carried off entirely by the bitterness that had once begun to consume him. She never knew, in those days, how much she was doing. She thought she was only being a friend. She did not see herself as the counterweight to a whole dark future, did not see that her ordinary loyalty was quietly outbidding the promises of power that were being laid at his feet. She simply loved her oldest friend, and let that love be plain, and went on being good in the small, tireless way that was her nature. And that, it turned out, was enough. That was more than enough, for the one thing the darkness could not withstand was not a stronger argument or a greater force, but the steady, undramatic light of a person who had simply decided, without ever deciding, to be kind. Severus warmed himself at that light through all the years when he might have frozen, and slowly, without either of them marking the day it happened, the cold went out of him. Up next in Chapter 7, Turning Away from the Dark, we'll follow Severus to the hardest and most important choice of his young life, the moment when, for the love of his friend, he finally refused the path of the Death Eaters and chose her world over the one that had offered him power. There comes, in the shaping of a life, a single quiet choice that all the smaller choices have been leading toward, and when it arrives it does not announce itself with thunder. It comes on an ordinary evening, in an ordinary room, and it asks a plain question, and the whole of a person's future turns on the answer. For Severus Snape, that evening came in the last of his school years, when the far bright road he had so often glimpsed at last drew close enough to step onto, and he found himself standing at its very entrance, with the door held open for him, and only had to walk through. The wizard, whose name the older Slytherins spoke in hushed and worshipful tones, had been gathering followers, and the gathering had reached down into the school, into the very common room where Severus had spent so many uncertain evenings. Those who had marked him as promising made it known, in the careful sideways manner of such people, that a place could be found for him. His gifts had not gone unnoticed. His skill with potions and with the darker corners of magic was exactly the sort of thing that Circle prized, and they let him understand that if he wished it, when his schooling ended, there would be a door and a welcome and a purpose waiting on the other side. They did not call it what it was. They dressed it in the language of belonging and importance and a great cause. But Severus was clever, and he knew, underneath all the dressing, precisely what was being offered him. He was being offered a way to become one of the Death Eaters, and everything that would mean. And for a long moment, a moment that in truth had been years in the making, he felt the old pull rise in him one final time, stronger than it had ever been, because it was no longer a distant shimmer, but a real hand extended. A real place with his name on it. All the aches of his boyhood leaned toward it. Here was the answer to the shabbiness and the whispers, to every corridor where he had been hexed and humiliated, to the poverty and the smallness and the long ache of never having mattered. Here was power and importance and a circle that would prize him. The road that had shimmered on so many far evenings was now underfoot, and all he had to do was take the step. But a person does not arrive at such a moment unshaped by everything that came before, and Severus arrived at it carrying years of Lily's steady light inside him. And so, standing at the open door, he did the thing that all his smaller turnings had taught him to do. He thought of her. He thought of what he would have to become to walk through, and of what walking through would cost him. And the cost had a face, and the face was hers. He knew, with a clarity that no promise of power could cloud, that there was no version of this choice in which he served that man and kept his friend. The two things could not exist together. The cause he was being offered was built, at its very foundation, on the destruction of people like Lily, and to join it would be to raise his hand against the one person who had ever truly stood by him. He could have the dark road, or he could have her. He could not have both. It was, in the end, no contest at all, and yet it was the hardest thing he had ever done, and both of those things were true at once. It was no contest, because the moment he weighed the whole of that shining future against a single loyal friend, the future weighed nothing. And it was the hardest thing, because refusing meant turning his back on everything the frightened, hungry boy in him had wanted for as long as he could remember, meant closing with his own hand the door that promised to answer all his old hurts, meant choosing to remain, in the eyes of that circle, small and unimportant and unavenged. To say no was to give up the only revenge the world had ever offered him against a life that had been unkind. And he gave it up. For love of his friend, he gave it up. He turned away from the dark. He did not make a speech of it, and he did not throw it in the faces of those who had courted him, for that was not his way, and would in any case have been dangerous. He simply, quietly, let the door close. He let it be known, in the careful, indirect manner such things required, that the path was not for him, that his gifts would go elsewhere, that whatever they had thought they saw in him, they had seen wrongly. He chose her world, the world of a Muggle-born witch who was kind to house elves and stopped for crying children, over the world that had offered him greatness, and in choosing it he became, in that single evening, a different man than the one the darkness had been trying to grow. He could not have told you, that night, the full size of what he had done. He knew only that he felt lighter and more frightened at once. Lighter because a weight he had been carrying for years had suddenly been set down, and frightened because he understood that turning from such a circle was not a thing without danger. But underneath the fear, there was something he had not felt in a very long time. Something clean and unfamiliar, and it took him a while to recognize it as a kind of peace. He had chosen not to be lost. He had reached the very edge of the person he might have become, the bitter servant of a cruel cause, and he had looked at that person clearly, and he had decided that he did not want to be him. And the deciding had been possible only because there was someone else he wanted to be near more than he wanted to be powerful. In later years, when he was old enough to look back on his own life with the mercy that distance sometimes gives, Severus understood that this had been the hinge of everything, the choice on which the whole of his happiness had turned. Every good thing that came afterward, the quiet home, the gentled heart, the family he had not dared to imagine, all of it had flowed from that one evening when he stood at the open door and turned away. And he understood, too, that he had not made the choice alone. He had made it with years of her friendship at his back, with the memory of her kindness holding him steady, with her light showing him, even in the dark, which way was out. She had never once told him what to choose. She had only made it possible for him to want to choose well. The choosing itself was his, the hardest and most important act of his young life, and he had chosen her. And so the boy who had so nearly walked into the service of the Dark Lord walked instead out into a plainer and freer air, carrying nothing but his gifts and his friendship and the strange new peace of a soul that had refused to be spent. The dark road remained where it had always been, shimmering on its far side of the evening, but he had turned from it for the last time, and he would not look back. Something in him had settled that night, quietly and for good, the way a stone settles at last to the bed of a river after long years of being tumbled by the current. He was still poor, still marked by an unkind boyhood, still a young man with a great deal to fear from the world, but he was no longer for sale. And knowing that was a wealth of its own. Up next in Chapter 8, Leaving the Death Eaters Behind, we'll follow the quiet courage of that break in the days that came after, the danger of stepping away from a rising and unforgiving circle, and the slow relief of a life set free before it was ever truly caught. To refuse a thing in a single brave evening is one matter, and to hold to that refusal through all the ordinary days that follow is quite another. And it was in the days after his choosing that the true measure of Severus Snape's courage showed itself. For the circle he had turned from was not a club that let its almost members drift away with a shrug and a wave. It was a rising power in a darkening world, jealous of its own, watchful and unforgiving, and a young man who had been marked as promising and then quietly declined did not simply vanish from its notice. There was danger in what he had done, real danger, and he knew it, and he lived with it, and he did not turn back. That was the courage of it. Not the grand refusal in the open doorway, but the long, steady holding of the line in every gray morning that came afterward. He had never taken their mark. That was the mercy of the timing, and it was the thing that made his leaving possible at all. He had stepped away before he was ever truly one of them, before the final binding, before the point past which there is no easy return. He had stood at the edge of the circle and looked in, and been welcomed toward it, and then had drawn back while there was still drawing back to be done. And so when he made his quiet refusal, he was not a servant deserting his master, which would have been a death sentence, but a promising recruit who had, in the careful language of such things, declined to advance. It was a narrow door, and he passed through it in the last hour it was open, and he was wise enough afterward to know how narrow it had been. Still, declining was not the same as being safe. The ones who had courted him did not take kindly to being refused, and there were among them those with long memories and longer grudges, who did not forget the clever boy from Slytherin, who had been offered the world and turned up his nose at it. Severus understood that he would have to be careful for a very long time, perhaps for the rest of his life. He understood that his knowledge of that world, the very knowledge that had made him valuable to them, now made him a person they would rather not have wandering free with his eyes open. And so he made himself quiet. He drew no attention. He did not boast of his choice or condemn his old courtiers in the hearing of others. He simply lived plainly and kept his own counsel, and let the circle forget him as best it could, and watched the shadows without letting the shadows see him watching. There was a loneliness in this that he had not expected. To leave a company, even a company you have chosen not to join, is still to leave, and for a time he felt the particular chill of a man who has closed a door and now stands in the corridor outside it, not yet knowing which room he belongs in instead. The Slytherins who had once looked on him with interest now looked on him with something colder, and he learned to walk past their coldness without flinching. It was a price. He paid it. And the strange thing was that paying it, day after day, made him steadier rather than weaker. For a person who has given something up for a reason he believes in stands on firmer ground than one who has never had to choose at all. And through all of it there was Lily, and her presence turned the loneliness of his leaving into something bearable, and then into something almost sweet. She did not fully know, at first, the size of what he had refused, for he was not a man who spoke easily of such things even to her. But she felt the shift in him, the way one feels a change in the weather before it fully arrives, and she drew closer rather than further, as though some part of her understood that he had come through a fire and needed, now, a place to be warm. She asked no prying questions. She simply stayed, steady as ever, and let her staying be the answer to a danger she only half saw. And Severus, who had feared that turning from the dark might leave him with nothing, found instead that it had left him with the one thing that mattered, and that the one thing was enough to build a life on. The relief came slowly, the way relief usually does. It was not a single glad morning when he woke and knew himself to be free. It was a gradual loosening, a thing he noticed only in glimpses. He noticed it in the way his sleep grew easier, in the way the knot that had lived in his chest through all his uncertain years began, at last, to come undone. He noticed it in small, ordinary pleasures that the darkness would have crowded out, the taste of a quiet meal, the pleasure of a difficult potion brewed well for its own sake and not for any cruel purpose, the simple gladness of an afternoon spent beside his friend with nothing to fear from her and nothing to hide. He had chosen not to be lost, and now, day by unremarkable day, he was discovering what being found actually felt like, and it felt like peace. There would be a long war coming. He knew that better than most, for he had seen the shape of it from the inside of the circle that would wage it, and he did not fool himself that a man could simply step aside and be untouched by the storm that was gathering over the wizarding world. But he had made his choice about which side of that storm he would stand on, and having made it, he could face the coming years with a clear conscience, which is a lighter thing to carry into darkness than a divided one. He had left the Death Eaters behind before he ever belonged to them, and whatever came, he would not have their mark on his arm or their cruelties on his hands. His soul was his own. He had kept it at some cost and with some courage, and he meant to go on keeping it. There is a particular strength that comes only to those who have been tested and have held. A strength that the untested never quite acquire, and it was beginning, slowly, to grow in him. He walked a little straighter for it. He met the coldness of his old courtiers a little more calmly. And though the danger did not vanish, his fear of it grew smaller, worn down by the simple fact that he had already faced the worst of the choice and come through. In the quiet of those days, he sometimes thought of the boy he had so nearly been, the bitter servant of a cruel master, and he did not hate that boy, but pitied him, as one pities a version of oneself that was frightened and hungry and reaching for the wrong warmth. He knew how close he had come. He knew that a single friendship, held through years of pull and temptation, had stood between him and that lost life, and that he owed his freedom to a girl who had never once told him what to do, but had only, steadily, shown him what goodness looked like until he could not unsee it. And gratitude, in him, took the quiet form it takes in people who are not good with words. He simply stayed near her and made himself worthy of the choice he had made, and let the days carry him gently away from the danger he had left, out toward a plainer and kinder life that was, at last, beginning to open before him. Up next in Chapter 9, The Marauders Left Behind, we'll watch an old rivalry quietly cool, see James Potter and his friends fade from the center of the story, and follow Lily's heart as it turns, unhurried, not toward the boy who had once tormented her friend, but toward the friend who had always been there. There is a kind of story that does not end so much as it quietly turns aside, and this is one of them. For years, the tale of these two children had run alongside another tale, louder and brighter, the tale of James Potter and his three friends, the boys who moved through the castle as though the castle had been built for their amusement. Sirius Black with his careless laughter, Remus Lupin with his tired kindness, Peter Pettigrew trailing a little behind, and James at the center of it all, quick and clever and forever certain of himself. In the tale that truly happened, these four had loomed large over Severus, and the enmity between them had shaped him almost as much as anything else. But in this gentler telling, something in that old rivalry simply began to loosen, the way a knot loosens when no one keeps pulling at the ends. It was not that the marauders vanished from the school. They were still there, still laughing in the corridors, still winning at Quidditch and losing points and gaining them back. James still walked with that easy confidence, and Sirius still turned heads wherever he went. But the sharp thread that had tied Severus to them, the thread of hatred that in another life would have been drawn tighter year upon year, had gone slack. Severus, steadied by the one friendship he had refused to lose, no longer rose to every taunt. He had somewhere else to put his attention now, someone who mattered to him more than the boys who mocked him, and so the taunts, meeting no answering fire, began to lose their purpose. There is a truth about cruelty that the young rarely understand and the wise come to know slowly, which is that much of it is a kind of question, thrown out into the world to see what comes back. When Severus stopped throwing his own answers, when he turned away instead of turning to face them, the boys who had baited him found the game growing dull. It is hard to keep a fire burning when the other person will not bring wood to it. And so, without any grand truce, without apology or handshake, the old feud between Severus and the marauders simply began to cool, the way a hearth cools through the long hours of a night, from flame to ember to gray. James Potter noticed the change, though he could not have said what it was. He had spent years defining a small part of himself against Severus, against the pale, watchful Slytherin boy who seemed to carry a grievance the way other boys carried books. But that boy no longer looked at him with the same burning. There was something settled in Severus now, something that had found its ground elsewhere and against a person who has found his ground. The old provocations fall flat. James was not a cruel boy at heart, only a proud one, and pride, with nothing to push against, tends to soften into something easier. He grew, as boys do, and the growing carried him away from the sport of tormenting. And there was Lily, at the center of it all, though she had never asked to be. In the tale that truly happened, Lily's heart would in time turn toward James, drawn by the way he changed and matured, by the good man he was becoming. That version of her story is a fine one, warm in its own way. But this was a different current, and it carried her differently. For Lily's heart had never had far to travel. It did not need to be won across a great distance, did not need a rival transformed or a proud boy humbled into worthiness. The one who had always been there, the boy who had told her by a riverbank that she was a witch, the boy who had walked her home through the gray streets of a mill town summer after summer, was already close. Her heart did not have to turn toward someone new. It had only, slowly, and without her quite noticing, to recognize what had been beside it the whole while. So when the other girls whispered about James Potter, about his dark, untidy hair and his easy grin, Lily listened and smiled and felt none of the pull they felt. It was not that she thought little of him. She had come to see, as everyone did, that he was growing kinder, that the arrogance of his younger self was wearing away. But her own affection was already spoken for, in a quiet way she had not yet given a name to. She thought of Severus when she was tired and wanted the comfort of someone who knew her without explanation. She looked for him across the great hall out of habit, the way one looks for a familiar landmark. And she found, when she was honest in the private hours before sleep, that a day without a word from him felt somehow unfinished. The friendship, then, was not turning into rivalry between two boys for one girl's favor, as it might so easily have done. It was simply deepening on the ground it had always stood upon. The great triangle that shaped the true story, James and Lily and Severus, never formed here at all, or formed so faintly that it dissolved before it could do any harm. There was no bitter contest, no jealousy sharpening old wounds into new ones. There was only a slow settling, a quiet rearrangement of hearts into the shapes they had perhaps always meant to take. For Severus, the fading of the marauders from the center of his life was a mercy he could hardly have named. So much of his younger anger had been fed by them, by the humiliations he had swallowed and the resentments he had nursed in the dark. In another life, those resentments would have curdled into something poisonous, would have driven him toward people who promised him power to make up for all he had lacked. But here the poison never gathered. When the boys who had mocked him simply drifted out of the story, they took with them a great deal of the pain that might have shaped him wrongly. He was left lighter, freer, with more room in his heart for the things that were good. And so the four boys who had once seemed so central to everything became, in this telling, what they had perhaps always truly been, which was merely other people living their own lives. James would find his own path, and Sirius his, and Remus and Peter theirs. Their stories went on, out of sight of this one, and there is a comfort in that, in the knowledge that not every thread need be followed to be well. Some threads are best simply let go, allowed to trail off gently into the wider weave of the world. The castle grew quieter around Severus and Lily, or perhaps it was only that they had stopped listening for the old dangers. The corridors that had once held ambush now held nothing worse than the ordinary bustle of students, and the two of them moved through it side by side, unremarkable and content. An old rivalry, left to cool, had cooled at last, and in the space it left behind, something tender had room to grow. Neither of them spoke of it yet. It was too new and too soft for words, and words might have startled it away. But it was there, in the shared glances and the easy silences, in the way each of them began, without meaning to measure the days by the presence of the other. The years of school drew toward their close, and the world outside was beginning to darken in ways that would matter greatly before long. But for now, the danger was distant, and the two children of Cokeworth stood at the threshold of their grown lives with the rare good fortune of already knowing where their hearts belonged. What had been a friendship for so long was ready, quietly, to become something more. Up next in Chapter 10, A Quiet Courtship, we'll follow that friendship as it deepens at last into love, unhurried and sure. Two people who had known each other since childhood, discovering something more, built not on sudden passion, but on all the long years of understanding that came before. Love that comes on suddenly, like a storm off the sea, makes for a stirring tale. But it is not the only kind, and often not the truest. There is another kind that comes so slowly that no one can say precisely when it arrived, the way spring arrives, not on a single morning, but across 100 small warmings, until one day the world is green and you cannot remember the cold. This was the kind of love that grew between Severus and Lily, and because it grew so slowly, it was strong in the way that slow things are strong. They left Hogwarts as two people who had spent nearly all their lives in each other's company, and stepping out into the wider world only drew them closer. The school had given them a shape to their days, lessons and meals and the long shared hours in the library, and without it they might have drifted, as so many friends do, after the last summer of youth. But they did not drift. If anything, the loss of that familiar shape made each of them reach for the other more surely, and in reaching, they began to find that friendship was too small a word for what they had. It happened in ordinary moments, as the important things so often do. It happened when Severus, bent over some small experiment at his kitchen table, looked up to find Lily watching him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the potion and everything to do with him, and felt his heart give a strange soft turn he did not know what to make of. It happened when Lily, walking home through the muggle streets of the town where they had both grown up, reached without thinking for his hand, and found that his hand was already reaching for hers, and neither of them let go, and neither of them spoke of it, and the not speaking was its own kind of understanding. They were shy with each other at first, in the way of people who have known one another so long that a change feels almost dangerous. There was so much to lose. A friendship of that depth is a rare and precious thing, and both of them, in their private hearts, feared to risk it by asking for more. What if the asking spoiled what was already so good? What if, in reaching for love, they lost the friendship that had been the truest thing in either of their lives? And so for a time, they circled the truth without touching it, coming close and then drawing back, each waiting for the other to be brave. But love of the patient kind does not need bravery so much as time, and time they had. Slowly the shyness wore away, worn down by all the small kindnesses that passed between them. Severus, who had spent so much of his youth guarded and sharp, found himself softening in her company in ways he could not have imagined a few years before. He learned to let her see the tenderness he had always hidden, the gentleness beneath the wariness. And Lily, who had loved his loyalty and his cleverness for years without ever weighing them as a woman weighs the qualities of a man she might love, began to see him newly, to notice the quiet strength in him, the depth of feeling he tried so hard to keep from showing. Their courtship, when it finally came, was nothing like the courtships of story and song. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures, no words shouted across great distances. There was only a gradual leaning toward each other, a slow admission of something that had, in truth, been there for a very long time. They took walks together, as they had done since they were children, along the river and through the fields beyond the town. And the walks were the same as they had always been, except that now they walked closer. And now, the silences between them held something new and sweet. They shared meals and books and long evenings by the fire, and the sharing had a different weight now, a tenderness that had not been there before, or had been there all along without a name. It was a courtship built on knowing rather than discovering. Most young lovers spend their first months learning each other, uncovering the small facts and habits that make a person who they are. But Severus and Lily had done all that learning long ago. He knew that she bit her lip when she was thinking hard, and that she loved the smell of rain on warm stone, and that she carried a fierce protectiveness for anyone she thought was being treated unjustly. She knew that he grew quiet when he was hurt rather than loud, and that his sharpness was a shield and not a sword, and that beneath all his guardedness lived a loyalty so deep it had shaped the whole course of his life. They knew each other's wounds and each other's joys, knew the shape of each other's silences, and so their love did not have to be built from nothing. It had only to be recognized, the way one recognizes a room one has lived in for years and only now, in a certain light, sees fully for the first time. There was a great steadiness in this. Love that is founded on years of understanding does not blow hot and cold as young passion does. It does not burn brightly and then gutter out. It settles instead into something warm and constant, a low, steady flame. Neither of them ever doubted the other, because doubt requires a kind of ignorance, and they knew each other too well for ignorance. When Severus was silent, Lily did not wonder whether he had grown cold toward her. She knew his silences and could read the weather of them. When Lily was troubled, Severus did not fear he had lost her. He knew her heart and trusted it. This trust was the ground their love grew from, and it was ground that did not shift. The people who knew them were not surprised, or were surprised only that it had taken so long. Anyone who had watched the two of them across the years could see what had been growing between them, could see it perhaps more clearly than they had seen it themselves. There had always been a rightness to their pairing, a sense that these two people belonged in each other's company, and now that rightness had simply come into its full flower. It was as though the world had been quietly waiting for them to notice what everyone else had already understood. For Severus especially, this slow turning of friendship into love was a gift beyond anything he had ever dared to hope for. He had spent his childhood lonely and strange, believing in his darkest moments that he was the sort of person no one would ever choose. To be chosen now, and chosen by the one person whose good opinion had always meant everything to him, was to have the whole shape of his self remade. He had feared he would go through life unloved, and instead he found himself loved by the person he loved most in all the world. It undid, gently and completely, the loneliness that had haunted his early years. And for Lily, there was a deep peace in loving a man she trusted so entirely, a man whose heart she had known since they were both small enough to skip stones across the river. She had watched him grow from a lonely, difficult boy into a steadier soul, and she had had some part in that growing. And there was a quiet joy in loving what one has helped to nurture. Their love was not a wild adventure. It was a homecoming for both of them to a place they had somehow always belonged. The days softened around them, and the future, though uncertain in a darkening world, felt for the two of them like something they would meet together. What had begun as two lonely children finding one friend had become, at last, two grown people finding in each other a whole life. Up next in Chapter 11, A Wedding Neither Expected, we'll follow them to a small and tender ceremony, two outsiders finding a home at last in each other, and the strange and lovely turn of a life that might so easily have gone another way. Neither of them had ever imagined a wedding. That is a thing worth pausing on, for most people carry some picture of such a day, however faint, tucked away in a corner of the heart. But Severus had grown up believing that happiness of that ordinary sort belonged to other people. And Lily had never let her thoughts run so far ahead. And so, when the day came at last, it came not as the fulfillment of some long-held dream, but as a gentle surprise, a gift neither had thought to ask for, arriving quietly at the door of their lives. There was no grand engagement, no ceremony of asking staged for the benefit of onlookers. The decision to marry grew between them the way everything between them had grown, slowly and without fuss, until it was simply understood. One quiet evening the matter was settled, not with any single dramatic moment, but with the soft mutual recognition that this was the shape their lives were meant to take, that having found each other, they meant to stay found. It was less a question and an answer than the naming of something already true. They wanted nothing large. A great wedding, with all its crowds and spectacle, would have felt wrong to both of them, false somehow, out of keeping with who they were. They had always been outsiders, the two of them, the strange, lonely boy and the muggle-born girl, standing a little apart from the worlds they moved through. And an outsider learns to find comfort not in grand gatherings, but in small, warm, private things. So they chose a small ceremony, a gathering of only the few people who truly mattered, held in a quiet place away from noise and show. Lily's parents were there, kind and ordinary people who had never quite understood the magical world their daughter had entered, but who loved her without reservation and welcomed the quiet man she had chosen. They had known Severus for years, of course, the boy from the poorer part of town who had been so often at their daughter's side. And there was a rightness for them, too, in seeing the two children they had watched grow up now, standing together as adults. If they had once wondered about the intense, watchful boy their bright daughter kept close, those wonderings had long since eased into acceptance, and then into a genuine fondness. The day itself was simple and lovely in the way that only simple things can be. There were no ranks of guests, no long processions, no weight of expectation pressing down on the hours. There was only a small circle of people who cared, and a bride and a groom who had known each other nearly all their lives, and the quiet magic of two souls binding themselves together. Lily wore no elaborate gown, only something soft and pale that suited her. And there was in her face that day a kind of shining calm, the look of a woman entirely certain of what she was doing. And Severus, who had spent so much of his life guarded and closed, stood beside her with his defenses down, letting himself be seen in his happiness, which was perhaps the bravest thing he had ever done. For him, especially, the day carried a weight of feeling almost too large to hold. He had grown up in a home without much love, in a mill town that offered its poorer children little in the way of hope. He had believed, in the loneliest reaches of his boyhood, that he would go through life unwanted, that the one bright friendship of his childhood was the most he could ever expect, and more than he perhaps deserved. To stand now beside Lily Evans, to know that she had chosen him freely and gladly, to know that he was about to be joined to her not for a season, but for a life, was to feel the whole miserable weight of his early years lifted clean away. He had spent so long bracing against loss, and here instead was gain, more than he had ever dared to reach for. And for Lily there was a deep and quiet gladness in marrying the friend she had known the longest. There is a particular sweetness in giving your life to someone who has been part of it always, someone whose history is woven through your own from the earliest days you can remember. She was not marrying a stranger she had come to love in a rush of feeling. She was marrying the boy who had told her, by a riverbank when they were both children, what she truly was, the friend who had walked beside her through every year since. In binding herself to him, she was not leaving her old life behind so much as gathering it up and carrying it forward, whole. The vows they made were few and honest. They did not need flowery speeches to say what they meant, for they had spent their whole lives learning each other's hearts, and the promises passed between them carried the weight of all those years. To love and to stay, to be steady for each other through whatever came, to keep the friendship that had been the ground of everything, even as it flowered now into marriage. These were not new promises, so much as the naming aloud of things they had long lived by. The ceremony did not create their bond. It only blessed and sealed what was already there. There is a strangeness in it when one steps back to consider, a strangeness that is also a kind of wonder, for how easily this day might never have come at all. In the tale that truly happened, a single cruel word had shattered their friendship, and the two of them had walked away into separate lives, one toward darkness and grief, the other toward a different love and an early, sorrowful end. That the word was never said here, or was met with sorrow and forgiveness rather than with the closing of a heart, had turned the whole course of two lives. And now, because of that one small mercy long ago, here they stood, being married, when in another telling they would have been strangers, or worse than strangers. It is a thing to marvel at, how much can turn on so little, how the smallest kindness can open a door onto a whole life that would otherwise never have been. The small gathering shared a modest celebration afterward, a warm and easy evening with no grandeur to it, only good feeling. There was quiet laughter and simple food, and the deep contentment of people who have witnessed something true. Nothing about the day was showy, and everything about it was real, and those who were there would remember it not for any spectacle, but for the plain, radiant happiness of the two people at its center. When the evening drew to its close and the small circle of guests had gone, Severus and Lily were left alone together as husband and wife. Two outsiders who had at last found a home not in any place, but in each other. They had each spent their early years feeling a little apart from the world, a little unbelonging, and now that feeling was gone, dissolved in the simple fact of being bound to someone who understood them entirely. Home, they were learning, was not a house or a town. Home was a person, and each of them had found their home in the other. The strange and lovely turn of their lives had brought them here, to a marriage neither had expected, in a world that had once seemed to promise them so little. And before them now lay all the ordinary days of a shared life, the mornings and evenings and quiet years still to come, waiting to be filled with the small warm business of living together. Up next in Chapter 12, a home of books and potions will step across the threshold of the life they made, a household of gentle scholarship and quiet domesticity, his cauldrons and her charms, a home settled softly between the muggle and magical worlds. The home they made together was a modest one, neither grand nor fashionable, tucked in a quiet corner where the ordinary world and the magical world lay close beside each other. It was the sort of house that from the street looked much like any other, unremarkable to the passing eye, giving no hint of the gentle wonders within. And that suited them both, for they had never wanted to stand out, only to be at peace. What mattered was not how the house looked from without, but how it felt from within, and within it felt like a place where two souls had settled into exactly the life they were meant for. The first thing anyone stepping inside would have noticed was the books. They were everywhere, filling shelves that ran from floor to ceiling, stacked on tables, gathered in small towers in the corners of rooms. Some were Muggle books, novels and histories, and volumes of poetry that Lily had loved since her girlhood in the Muggle world. Others were books of magic, old and heavy, their spines cracked with use, their pages dense with the lore of charms and potions, and the deep workings of the wizarding craft. The two kinds of book sat side by side on the same shelves, and there was something fitting in that, for the house itself lived between the two worlds, belonging fully to neither and drawing quietly on both. And there were the potions. Severus had always had a rare gift for that particular branch of magic, a gift that in the tale that truly happened had made him one of the most skilled potioneers of his age, though at a terrible cost to his heart. Here the gift remained, but the bitterness that had once shadowed it was gone. He kept a small workroom at the back of the house, and it became the heart of his days, a place of gently steaming cauldrons and glass bottles catching the light, of shelves lined with dried herbs and ground roots and curious ingredients whose names most people would never know. There he worked at the craft he loved, patient and absorbed, brewing remedies and tonics and the many careful concoctions that his skill made possible. He was, it turned out, a healer at heart, though he would perhaps have been slow to call himself so. His potions were not made for power or for harm, but for good. He brewed remedies for aches and illnesses, draughts to ease pain and mend small hurts, careful mixtures that helped the sick and comforted the suffering. People came to know that in that quiet house lived a man whose potions could help them, and they came, some from the magical world, and some who never suspected there was any magic in it at all, and he helped them as he could. The boy who had once been tempted toward dark arts had become, in this gentler life, a maker of healing things, and there was a deep rightness in that, a sense of a gift turned at last toward its proper use. Lily brought her own magic to the household, a warmth that filled the rooms as surely as any charm. Her gift had always been for the bright and living branches of magic, for charms and for the small enchantments that make a home feel alive. Under her hand, the house grew comfortable in 100 quiet ways. A fire that lit itself gently against the evening chill. A kettle that seemed always to know when it was wanted. Small tidyings and mendings that happened as if by their own accord, so that the place had about it a feeling of being cared for by unseen, kindly hands. It was not showy magic, nothing to astonish a visitor, only the soft, steady enchantment of a home tended by someone who loved it. But her warmth was more than magic. Lily had always had a gift for making people feel at ease, for kindness that asked nothing in return, and that gift shaped the household as much as any spell. Where Severus was quiet and inward, given to long absorbed hours in his workroom, Lily was the open door, the ready welcome, the one who drew people gently into the circle of the home. Together, they made a balance, his depth and her brightness, his careful patience and her easy warmth. Each was, in a sense, what the other lacked, and in their joining, they made a whole that was steadier and kinder than either could have been alone. Their days took on a gentle rhythm, the sort of rhythm that is easy to overlook precisely because there is nothing dramatic in it. They rose together and shared the small, ordinary business of the morning. Severus would spend his hours at his cauldrons, and Lily at whatever occupied her, and the two of them would come together again through the day, meeting in the kitchen or the book-lined sitting room, sharing what they had done and thought. There was a great deal of quiet in their life, but it was a companionable quiet, the comfortable silence of two people who have no need to fill every moment with words. They had spent their whole lives learning to be easy in each other's company, and now they had that ease in full measure. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, often each with a book, the two of them reading in the same warm room, looking up now and then to share some passage or some passing thought. It was scholarship of a gentle domestic kind, two curious minds moving through their books side by side. And there was in it a deep and quiet happiness. Severus, who had once feared he would spend his life alone, now spent his evenings in the company of the one person he most wished to be near. And Lily, who had always loved learning and loved warmth, had a home that held both in abundance. They wanted for very little, because what they wanted most, they already had. The house between the two worlds became, for both of them, a refuge from all that they had once feared. Severus had grown up in poverty and unhappiness, in a home where love was scarce and comfort scarcer. To live now in a place of warmth and books and healing craft, with a wife who loved him and a life of gentle purpose, was to have everything the boy he had been could never have imagined. And Lily, who as a Muggle-born witch had sometimes felt caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, had made a home that held both worlds together, where the Muggle books and the magical ones shared the same shelves and no one had to choose. In that house, the two worlds were not at war, but at peace, and so were the two people who lived in it. There was, too, a kind of quiet safety in the ordinariness of their life. Great and terrible things were beginning to stir in the wider wizarding world, as they had a way of doing, but the house between the worlds sat a little apart from all that, sheltered by its very smallness and quietness. The couple asked for no attention and drew none, and in their modest domesticity they found a peace that grander lives could not have offered. They had chosen, without quite saying so, a life of small good things rather than large dangerous ones, and it was a choice that served them well. Seasons passed over the little house, and the pattern of their days deepened into something settled and sure. The books grew more numerous, the workroom more crowded with the tools of Severus's craft, the home more thoroughly their own. What they had built was not remarkable in any way the world would notice, and that was precisely its beauty. Two people who had once been lonely children in a gray mill town had made themselves a home of warmth and learning, a place of quiet scholarship and gentle care, and they lived in it contented, wanting nothing more than what they had. Up next in Chapter 13, the war they chose to survive will turn to the darkening world beyond their door, the shadow of Voldemort rising over the wizarding world, and a quiet couple determined to keep their heads down and their love safe rather than be swept into the fire. There is a kind of darkness that does not arrive all at once. It comes the way a winter evening comes, so gradually that no single moment can be marked as the one in which the light was lost. So it was with the world beyond the small house where Severus and Lily had made their life. While they filled their days with cauldrons and books, with the ordinary warmth of shared meals and shared silences, a shadow was lengthening across the wizarding world, and it had a name that people had already begun to be afraid to say aloud. Lord Voldemort was rising. He had gathered to himself the angry and the ambitious, the cruel and the frightened, and he had promised them a world remade in the image of their oldest prejudices. His followers called themselves Death Eaters, and they moved through the country like a sickness, leaving behind them families broken and homes emptied and a green mark burning in the night sky above the places where they had done their work. The first Wizarding War had begun, though no one had declared it, and it spread not as a single battle, but as a slow, creeping fear that settled into every corner of magical Britain. Severus knew that fear better than most, because he had once stood at its very edge. He remembered the common room conversations of his school years, the talk of blood and purity, the way certain older boys had spoken of a great man who would set things right. He remembered how close he had come to walking through that particular door, and how it was only the steady presence of one person that had turned him aside at the last. Now, watching the news of each fresh cruelty arrive, he understood with a cold clarity exactly what he had chosen not to become. He might have worn that mark. He might have been one of the figures in the dark. Instead, he was here, at a wooden table in a quiet kitchen, alive and unashamed. And the difference between those two lives was measured in a single friendship that had refused to die. Lily felt the danger differently, but no less keenly. She was Muggle-born, and she knew what that word meant in the mouths of the men who followed Voldemort. To them, she was something less than a witch, something to be despised and swept aside. And she understood that in the eyes of the Death Eaters, her very existence was an offense. She did not let that knowledge harden her, for that was not her way. But she did not pretend it away either. She watched the world grow more dangerous, and she thought carefully, as she had always thought carefully, about how two people might keep themselves and their love safe in a time when so much was being lost. They did not talk of the war in loud voices or in grand terms. They were not the sort to make speeches, even to each other. Instead, they made 100 small decisions, the way careful people do, each one a quiet thread woven into the fabric of their safety. They chose to keep their home unremarkable, a modest place on the border between the Muggle world and the magical one, in a district where no one thought to look for anything worth harming. They kept their circles small and their movements ordinary. Severus, who had spent his whole childhood learning to be unnoticed, put that hard-won skill to gentler use now, teaching them both how to move through dangerous days without drawing the wrong kind of attention. It would be wrong to call this cowardice, though there were surely some who might have named it so. It was something quieter and, in its own way, braver, they had decided, the two of them, that they would not be swept into the fire. They had seen what the war did to those who threw themselves against it without care, the young and the fierce who burned bright and burned out. And they had seen too what it did to those who joined the other side and lost their souls piece by piece. Severus and Lily wanted neither of those fates. They wanted to survive, and more than that, they wanted to keep intact the small good thing they had built, the very thing the war seemed determined to destroy wherever it found it. So they were watchful. Severus warded their home with a care that bordered on tenderness, laying spell upon spell across the doors and windows, drawing on knowledge he had gathered in his darker years and turning it now to the single purpose of protection. He knew the enemy's habits because he had once studied to be part of them, and that knowledge, which might have made him dangerous, made him instead a guardian. He knew the signs to watch for. He knew which streets to avoid and which names not to speak. Lily, for her part, brought her own quiet strength to their defense, for she had always had a gift for protective magic, a warmth in her spell work that seemed to wrap around the things she loved and hold them close. In the evenings, when the wards were set and the curtains drawn, they allowed themselves to forget the war for a little while. This was its own kind of survival, perhaps the most important kind. They understood that a heart cannot live on fear alone, that even in the darkest season a person must find some hours of ordinary peace or else be hollowed out from the inside. So they read to each other by the fire. They brewed together, the steam rising soft and fragrant between them. They spoke of small things, of a recipe that had not quite worked, of a memory from the river years ago, of nothing at all. And in those hours, the war seemed very far away, held back beyond the wards like weather beyond a window. Yet, they did not deceive themselves. They knew that the storm outside was real, and that many people, good people, were suffering in it. There was a grief that lived quietly alongside their happiness, a knowledge that their safety was not shared by all, that friends and acquaintances from their school years were being drawn into the conflict on one side or another, and that some of them would not come through it. Lily thought often of those she had known, of the fierce ones who had joined the fight against Voldemort, and she felt for them a tenderness edged with worry. Severus thought of the ones who had gone the other way, the boys he had shared a common room with, now grown into men who served a monster, and he felt a strange, sorrowful gratitude that he was not among them. This, then, was the war they chose to survive. Not by fighting it in the open, not by fleeing it entirely, but by tending their small flame of love and keeping it alight through the long dark. They bent their heads to the wind and let it pass over them, and they held on to each other, and they waited for the world to find its way back toward morning. It was not a heroic choice, in the way that stories usually mean heroic. It was something humbler and more human. It was the choice of two people who had already lost too much in their separate childhoods, and had finally found something worth protecting, and who were determined, above all else, not to lose it now. And so the seasons turned, and the war deepened, and in a quiet house on the border of two worlds, a witch and a wizard kept their love safe, night after careful night, refusing to let the darkness in. But surviving a war is not the same as ignoring it, and the days would come when the wider world pressed closer than they wished, and hard questions would arrive at their door. Up next, in Chapter 14, Standing Apart from Voldemort, we'll follow the careful path they walked between two dangers, refusing to serve the Dark Lord and refusing to be destroyed by him. And we'll see how the very knowledge Severus once gathered in shadow became the thing that helped keep them both safe. There is a narrow way that a person can walk when the world divides itself into two great and terrible sides. It is the path between them, thinner than a thread, that asks a soul neither to serve the horror nor to be swallowed by it. Few manage to keep to that path for long, because the war pulls at everyone, dragging them toward one edge or the other. Yet Severus and Lily walked it, quietly and with great care, through the darkest years of the First Wizarding War, and the manner of their walking is a gentle thing to consider on the way toward sleep. On the one side stood Voldemort and his Death Eaters, offering power to those who would kneel and pain to those who would not. On the other side stood those who threw themselves into open battle against him, brave and burning, many of them destined to fall. Between these two fires lay a slender space, and it was there that the witch and the wizard chose to make their stand, if a thing so quiet can be called a stand at all. They would not raise the dark mark. They would not raise a martyr's banner either. They would simply refuse, again and again, to take part in the horror, and they would do it without announcing it to anyone. This refusal was not as simple as staying home. Voldemort's followers had long memories and longer reach, and there were those among them who remembered Severus from his school days. He had been a clever boy, gifted beyond his years in potions and in the darker arts, and there had been a time when certain of them had marked him as one who might join their number. That he had not done so was noticed. In a movement built on loyalty and fear, a young man who had turned away was a curiosity, and curiosity, in such circles, could curdle easily into suspicion. Severus understood this danger better than anyone, and he managed it with the same quiet skill he had once used to survive a difficult childhood. His knowledge of that world became, strangely, one of the things that kept them safe. Because he had once stood so near the edge, he knew how the Death Eaters thought and moved. He knew the words they used among themselves and the ways they tested a person's allegiance. He knew, too, how to answer a careless question without giving anything away. How to seem uninteresting to dangerous people. How to be forgotten by those it was safest to be forgotten by. When old acquaintances crossed his path, as they sometimes did, he neither fawned nor defied. He gave them nothing to grip, no offense to punish, and no eagerness to exploit. And slowly, over time, they lost interest in the pale, private man who kept to himself and his cauldrons. Lily's protection was of a different kind, but no less vital. She had a way of reading the temper of a situation, of sensing when a moment had grown dangerous. And her instincts more than once steered them away from harm before harm had fully formed. She understood people, their small vanities and their sudden cruelties, and she used that understanding to keep their little household beneath notice. Together the two of them formed something greater than either alone, his knowledge of the shadow paired with her knowledge of the human heart, and between them they charted a course that kept them clear of the worst of the storm. They were tested, of course. No one lived through those years untested. There were nights when the wards around their home hummed with the passing of something dark, when Severus stood in the dim kitchen with his wand in his hand and his heart steady, listening to the quiet, ready to defend the one he loved if it came to that. There were days when news arrived of some fresh atrocity, some family they had known reduced to grief, and the temptation rose in both of them to do something, to strike back, to fling themselves into the fight. It would have been the easier feeling to follow. Anger is always easier than patience. Yet they held to their narrow path, and their holding was a discipline of love rather than fear. They reminded each other, in the small ways that people who have known one another for many years can, that survival was itself a form of resistance. Every day that they remained alive and unbroken. Every day that Severus did not become the thing he had almost become. Every day that Lily lived free in a world that wished her gone was a small defeat handed to the darkness. They would not give Voldemort the satisfaction of turning them into monsters, and they would not give him the satisfaction of destroying them either. They would simply endure, and in enduring, deny him. It helped that they wanted nothing the war could offer. Voldemort's power held no appeal for a man who had already found the only thing he had ever truly wanted, and who understood, better now than ever, that the promises of the Dark Lord were built on the ruin of everything worth having. Severus had looked into that particular abyss as a young man and had turned away from it, and the years since had only deepened his certainty. He had seen where that road led. He had watched, from a safe distance, as boys he had known walked it and were hollowed out along the way, until nothing remained of them but cruelty wearing a human shape. He wanted no part of it, and wanting no part of it, he was very hard to tempt. This was, perhaps, their greatest protection of all. The Death Eaters knew how to sway the ambitious and how to break the defiant, but they had no easy answer for a man who simply, quietly, wanted to be left alone with the woman he loved. There was no lever to pull, no hunger to feed, no fear to inflame beyond the ordinary fear that any person feels in dangerous times, and that fear Severus had long ago learned to master. And so, again and again, the shadow passed over their small house and did not settle, moving on toward louder and more visible prey. None of this was without cost. To walk between two fires is to be warmed by neither, and there were lonely stretches in those years, times when the two of them felt cut off from the wider world, unable to speak freely, unable to trust widely, watching friends and strangers alike be drawn into a conflict they had chosen to stand apart from. There was a weariness in constant vigilance, a heaviness in always being careful, but they carried it together, and a burden shared between two who love each other is a lighter thing than the same burden carried alone. So they stood apart from Voldemort, not as heroes charging into legend, but as two careful souls threading a needle in the dark. They refused to serve him, and they refused to die for the sake of a gesture. And in that double refusal, they found a kind of quiet dignity that the loud world of the war could not touch. Their resistance was invisible to almost everyone, unrecorded in any history, known only to the two of them and to the walls of their small warded home. And yet it was real, and it was theirs, and it held. But standing apart from the darkness is not the same as doing nothing at all. There is a difference between hiding from the world and quietly helping it, and as the war ground on, the witch and the wizard would find that their careful distance did not mean indifference. There were ways, small and hidden, that even the most private of people could tip the scales toward the light. Up next in Chapter 15, The Order's Quiet Ally, we'll see how Severus and Lily lent their knowledge and their shelter to the Order of the Phoenix from the shadows, doing good in secret and offering help where it was needed most, all without letting the war consume the peace they had worked so hard to keep. To stand apart from a war is not always to stand idle within it. There is a quiet form of goodness that works in the margins, unseen and unthanked, and it was this form that Severus and Lily came to practice as the first wizarding war deepened around them. They had chosen not to be swept into the fire, and they held to that choice. Yet neither of them could look upon the suffering of the world and feel nothing. And so, without ever stepping fully into the open, they found their own small ways to help. There existed in those years a company of witches and wizards who had banded together to resist Voldemort, gathered around the great and gentle wizard Albus Dumbledore. They called themselves the Order of the Phoenix, and they took upon themselves the dangerous work that the frightened ministry could not or would not do. They watched, and they warned, and they stood in the path of the darkness where they could. It was brave work, and it was costly work, and many who did it did not live to see the war's end. Severus and Lily were not members of the Order, not in the way that those who fought openly were members. They did not attend its meetings or answer its calls to battle. And yet, they became, in their quiet way, its friends. It happened gradually, as such things do. Lily had known, from her school years, some of those who now stood in the Order's ranks, and old friendships do not vanish simply because the world grows dangerous. Word reached her, through careful and roundabout channels, that the Order was in need, that it lacked certain things that a clever and well-stocked household might quietly provide. And Lily, who had never in her life been able to turn away from someone in need, found that she could not turn away now. What they offered was not the sword, but the hand behind it. Severus, whose gift for potions had grown only more remarkable with the years, brewed in secret the things that healers and fighters needed and could not easily make for themselves. He brewed draughts to close wounds and draughts to ease pain, antidotes to poisons that the Death Eaters favored, restoratives for those who had been broken by dark curses and needed slow mending. He knew the enemy's methods, remember, better than most of the Order's own healers, because he had once studied at the edge of that world, and so he knew the remedies too. A vial of the right potion, arriving quietly at the right moment, saved lives that no one would ever connect to the pale, private man who had made it. This was work he could do without ever leaving his own kitchen, and there was a rightness in that which pleased something deep in him. The very knowledge that might have made him dangerous, the dark and difficult learning of his youth, he turned now wholly to the purpose of healing. It was as though he were taking the darkest threads of his own past and weaving them, at last, into something good. Lily saw this, and it moved her more than she could easily say, for she remembered the boy he had been, the lonely and bitter child pulled toward shadow, and she marveled at the man he had become, bending his hardest-won gifts toward the saving of strangers. Their home became, in time, a quiet haven as well. It was warded more strongly than almost any place in the district, and it lay unremarked upon the border of two worlds, and these things made it a safe stopping place for those who needed one. There were nights when a weary member of the Order, hunted and exhausted, found their way to the small house and were taken in without question, given food and a bed and a few hours of safety before moving on. Lily tended these travelers with a warmth that asked for nothing in return, and Severus, though he was never a man of many words, saw to it that they left stronger than they had come, their wounds dressed and their strength restored. They did all of this in shadow, and the shadow was not born of shame, but of wisdom. To be known as a friend of the Order was to become a target, and a target could not offer much help for long. So they kept their names out of things. They asked for no thanks and left no trace. The potions arrived without a sender, and the travelers came and went by night, and the small house on the border remained, to all outward appearances, the ordinary home of an ordinary couple who wanted nothing to do with the war. Only a very few knew the truth, and those few kept it close, and so the arrangement endured through the long years of the fighting. There was wisdom, too, in the limits they set upon themselves. They had seen what the war did to those who gave it everything, who poured themselves into the fight until nothing remained, and they were careful not to be consumed in that way. They helped where they could, and they did not help where they could not, and they did not let the guilt of what they left undone poison the good that they managed to do. This was a hard balance to strike, for a tender heart is always tempted to do more, to save everyone, to stand between every innocent and every harm. But Severus and Lily understood that a well can only give water so long as it is not emptied, and that to keep helping through a long war, they had to keep something of themselves in reserve. And so they tended their own peace even as they tended the wounded. In the evenings, when the day's quiet work was done, they returned to each other and to the small warm rituals that held them together, and in those hours they replenished what the war had drawn from them. This was not selfishness. It was the very thing that let them go on giving. A candle that burns itself out gives no more light, but a candle carefully tended can burn through the whole long night. And it was such a candle that they chose to be. There is a particular beauty in goodness done in secret. The loud kind of goodness, the kind that charges into battle and is sung about afterward, has its own bright glory, and the world has need of it. But there is another kind that works in silence, that asks for no song and leaves no monument, that is known only to the one who gives and the one who receives, and perhaps to no one else at all. This was the goodness of Severus and Lily. No history would record their names among the heroes of that war. No one would raise a statue to the quiet couple who brewed potions in the dark and opened their door to the hunted. And yet the good they did was real, woven invisibly into the survival of others, a small, steady light held up against a very great darkness. They asked for nothing, and they received, in the end, the only reward they had ever wanted, which was to reach the war's far side with their souls intact and their love unbroken, having harmed no one and helped where they could. It was enough. It was more than enough. Somewhere out in the dark, a fighter they would never meet slept a little easier because of a potion whose maker they would never know. And somewhere else, a hunted soul woke, rested in a bed they would never learn the name of, and that unseen good was reward beyond any name or thanks the world could offer. And through it all, at the center of everything, was the slow and steady change that love had been working in Severus for many years, softening the sharp and guarded boy into a man who could open his door to a stranger in the night without a second thought. Up next in Chapter 16, Severus, gentled by love, We'll linger on that quiet transformation, the slow softening of a hard heart, and we'll see how the bitter and wounded boy of the mill town grew, under the long warmth of being loved, into a steadier and kinder man than anyone who had known him young would ever have believed. Of all the changes the years had wrought, none was so quiet or so complete as the change in Severus himself. It did not happen in a single moment. There was no bright flash of transformation, no sudden turning of a page. Instead, it happened the way a stone is worn smooth by water, slowly, patiently, over so long a time that no one watching could have named the day it was finished. The bitter and guarded boy of the mill town had become, without quite noticing it, a steadier and gentler man, and the thing that had worn him smooth was love. To understand the size of that change, one must remember the boy he had been. He had grown up in a cold house in Cokeworth, unhappy and often afraid, a child who learned early that the world was more likely to wound him than to welcome him. He had been strange and clever and lonely, dressed in ill-fitting clothes, sharp of tongue because his tongue was the only defense he had. He had guarded himself the way a small animal guards itself, tensed always against the next blow, quick to expect cruelty, because cruelty was mostly what he had known. And within him, in those young years, there had grown a bitterness, a hard-coiled thing that might so easily have become the whole of him. There had been a version of his life, a shadow that never fell, in which that bitterness did win. In that unlived life, the wound of a lost friendship festered, and the coldness closed over him entirely, and the lonely boy grew into a cold and dangerous man who wore his pain as armor and turned it, in the end, into something like hatred. It was not a difficult future to imagine. The seeds of it had all been there. But that future never came, because a single friendship was kept where it might have been lost, and everything else grew from that keeping. Being loved changes a person, though it does its work so gently that the person is often the last to see it. For Severus, the change came in 10,000 small moments spread across many years. It came in the simple, astonishing fact of being chosen, day after day, by someone who knew him fully and stayed anyway. Lily had known him at his worst. She had known the sharp boy, the jealous boy, the boy who had once been tempted toward the darkest of ideas, and she had not turned away. She had seen the wound beneath the sharpness and had chosen to tend it rather than to flinch from it. And a wound that is tended, at long last, begins to heal. The sharp edges came off him slowly. In his youth, he had been quick to take offense, quick to read insult into innocent things, always braced for the rejection he had learned to expect. But it is hard to keep bracing for a blow that never falls. Year after year passed in which the woman beside him did not leave, did not mock, did not turn cold, and year after year the old readiness for pain loosened its grip on him. He grew slower to anger and slower to suspicion. He learned, haltingly, that not every silence hid a cruelty, that not every closeness would end in loss. He learned to trust, which for a boy raised as he had been raised was perhaps the hardest lesson of all and the most transforming. Those who had known him young would scarcely have recognized the man he became. The bitterness that had once seemed so essential to him, so bound up with who he was, had quietly loosened and fallen away, like old bark from a growing tree. In its place had come something steadier, a calm that ran deep. He was still quiet. He was still private. He would never be a man of easy laughter or open warmth towards strangers, for a nature is not erased, only softened. But the coldness was gone from him, and the cruelty that might have been never came, and in their place there was a gentleness that showed itself in 1,000 undramatic ways. It showed in his patience, which had once been so thin and had grown, with the years, deep and forgiving. It showed in the tenderness of his hands as he worked, in the care he took over the potions he brewed for the hurt and the hunted, in the quiet attentiveness with which he moved through his own home. It showed in the way he listened, really listened, to the woman he loved, and in the way his hard-guarded face softened when she entered a room. Small things, all of them, easily missed by anyone who did not know to look. But they were the marks of a soul that had been mended, and taken together they told the whole story of his change. There was a further truth in it, subtler still, which was that he did not only receive love, but learned to give it. This was, in some ways, the greater miracle. It is one thing to be softened by being loved, to have one's edges worn down by another's steady warmth. It is another thing to become, oneself, a source of that warmth, to turn outward the tenderness one has received and offer it freely to another. Severus learned to do this, slowly and imperfectly, and the learning of it was the truest measure of how far he had come. The boy who had once had nothing to give but sharpness became a man who could give shelter and care and a quiet, unwavering devotion. He chose love, not once but daily, and in the choosing he was remade. Lily watched this happen over the long years with a wonder that never quite faded. She had believed in him when there was little enough reason to, when he was a difficult and wounded boy pulled toward a darkness that frightened her. She had seen something in him worth saving, and she had refused to give up on it. And now, looking at the steady, gentle man he had become, she felt that her faith had been answered beyond anything she could have hoped. She had not changed him by force or by pleading. She had simply been good and stayed and let her goodness do its slow work, and that had been enough. Kindness, it turned out, was not weakness after all. It was the strongest thing either of them had ever known, strong enough to reshape a life. And so the man who might have been lost was found instead, not by any great heroic act, but by the long, patient work of a love that would not let go. The hard-coiled thing inside him had unwound. The armor had been set down, no longer needed. What remained was simply a man, quieter and kinder than the boy he had been, sitting in the warm lamplight of a home he had never expected to have, beside the one person who had known him longest and loved him best. It was a gentle ending to the story of a hard beginning, and it had come to pass so softly that neither of them could say quite when it was finished, only that it was. Sometimes, on a still evening, he would catch himself at rest in his own chair, easy in his own skin, and marvel in a quiet and wordless way at the distance he had traveled from the tense and frightened boy he had once been. A distance measured not in miles, but in years of being loved and choosing, each day, to love in return. For a heart that has been softened and steadied by love does not keep that gift to itself for long. It grows, in time, toward the wish to give what it has been given, to make of its own peace a shelter for someone new. And, in the quiet house on the border of two worlds, as the war beyond began at last to loosen its grip, that wish was beginning gently to stir. Up next, in Chapter 17, Children of Their Own, we'll follow the family they build together, a child raised in a home of warmth and learning, and we'll see two people who each once feared they would be alone, discovering the deep and quiet joy of a home filled with love. There came a morning, some years into their quiet married life, when the little house between the Muggle lanes and the hidden magical world grew fuller than it had ever been. A child was born to Severus and Lily, and the world outside carried on exactly as it always had, indifferent and gray, while inside those walls everything had changed forever. The two of them, who had each once lain awake in separate childhoods, fearing that they would always be alone, now stood together over a small sleeping bundle and understood, without needing to say it, that neither of them would ever be alone again. They were not people who had expected this. Lily had grown up gentle and warm, but even she had known seasons of loneliness, the strange ache of a girl who belonged fully to neither the muggle world of her sister nor the magical one that had claimed her. And Severus had spent his boyhood as the loneliest creature in the grey mill town of Cokeworth, a strange and guarded child who had believed, deep in the bruised places of his heart, that he was the sort of person the world simply left behind. To hold a child of their own, then, was for both of them a kind of quiet astonishment, a gift they had never dared to plan for. The house filled slowly with the small clutter of a family. Where once there had been only shelves of books and rows of gleaming potion bottles, now there were soft blankets folded over the arms of chairs, and little wooden toys that Severus carved by hand in the long evenings, and a cradle set near the hearth where the firelight could reach it. Lily hung bright curtains at the windows, and the light that came through them fell warm and golden across the floor. The old bitterness that had once lived in the corners of Severus's world seemed to have no room left to gather. There was simply too much life in the way. Severus, who had been so sharp and so guarded as a young man, surprised even himself in those first months. He learned the particular weight of a sleeping child against his shoulder and the slow rhythm of pacing a darkened room in the small hours, and the way a tiny hand would close around a single one of his long fingers and hold on as though it would never let go. He, who had once believed that tenderness was a weakness the world would punish, found that tenderness had quietly become the whole shape of his days. He was patient in a way the boy from Cokeworth would never have recognized. He was gentle, and the gentleness cost him nothing. Lily watched him with a soft, private wonder. She had always believed there was more to her oldest friend than the world allowed him to show, had believed it even in the years when others saw only a scowling boy at the edge of the corridor. Now she saw the proof of it every day, in the careful way he warmed a bottle to exactly the right heat with a flick of his wand, in the low murmured lullabies she sometimes overheard when he thought no one was listening. The boy who had once been drawn toward power and cold ideas of purity had become a father who counted small breaths in the dark and gave thanks for every one. The child grew as children do, quickly and then all at once. There were first words and first stumbling steps across the worn rug before the fire, and the endless bright questions that only a small child can ask. Why is the moon awake in the daytime? Why does the potion turn blue and then green? Why do the owls come only at night? Severus, who had spent a lifetime hoarding knowledge as though it were treasure, discovered a deep and unexpected joy in giving it away, in kneeling to a child's height and explaining the world in small, patient pieces. Lily filled the house with laughter and with charms that made the toys tidy themselves and the candles light at dusk, and she taught their child the older, plainer magics too, the muggle kind, how to be kind and how to listen and how to notice when someone else was sad. They raised the child between two worlds, just as they themselves had always lived between them. There were quiet afternoons in the Muggle town, ice cream in paper cups, and the ordinary music of traffic and church bells. And there were evenings when the whole house seemed to hum with soft enchantment, when the ceiling above the cradle was charmed to show a slow drift of stars. The child knew both worlds and feared neither, and grew up believing, as only a truly loved child can, that the world was fundamentally a safe and gentle place. It was the belief that neither Severus nor Lily had been given as children, and to give it now, freely and completely, felt to both of them like healing a wound they had almost forgotten they carried. There were small rituals that shaped those years, the kind that no one plans and everyone remembers. Each evening ended the same way, with a story read aloud in the lamplight and a soft goodnight murmured at the door. And each morning began with the same warm bustle, the kettle singing and the owls arriving with the post. These were the ordinary sacraments of a happy home, repeated so often that they wore themselves into the grain of the house. In the evenings, when the day's small labors were done and the child slept at last, the two of them would sit together by the fire, much as they always had. But now their quiet was fuller than before, weighted with a contentment so deep it hardly needed words. Severus would sometimes look toward the darkened doorway of the child's room, and Lily would follow his gaze, and neither of them would speak, because there was nothing that needed saying. They had built, out of two lonely beginnings, a home where a child could grow up loved. It was the plainest thing in the world, and it was everything, Severus thought, in those still hours, of the boy he had been, the one who had believed love was a door forever closed to him. He wished, sometimes, that he could reach back across all those years and tell that thin, angry child that he need not be afraid, that a warm house and a loving wife and a small sleeping face were all waiting for him at the far end of the long road. If only he would choose the right turnings. He could not reach that boy, of course, but he could give to his own child everything that boy had lacked, and in the giving he found that the old ache had grown faint and distant, like the memory of a cold he no longer felt. Lily, for her part, sometimes thought of all the paths her life might have taken, the friendships that might have broken, the loves she might have chosen instead. She did not dwell on them. She had followed her heart toward the one person who had known her longest, and it had led her here, to this warm room, and this sleeping child, and this quiet man, who loved them both beyond all measure. She had no regrets to keep her awake. She had only gratitude, steady and plain, the kind that settles over a life like a soft blanket and asks for nothing in return. Outside the little house, far beyond the Muggle lanes and the hidden magical world, darker things were stirring. There was a war in those years, and shadows gathering, and a name that men feared to speak aloud. But within these walls the fire burned low and warm, and a child slept safely, and two people who had once feared they would always be alone kept watch over the small, bright life they had made. For now, that was enough. For now, the family was whole, and the night was quiet, and the danger stayed far away. Up next in Chapter 18, The Dark Lord's Fall, from afar, we will follow the distant end of the war that never touched this family. The undoing of the Dark Lord as the wider world had always been fated to see it, and the way a quiet home survived it whole, protected not by power, but by every gentle choice that had been made along the way. The war did not come to the little house between the Muggle lanes and the hidden magical world, but it came near enough that its shadow could sometimes be felt at the edges of the day. In those years, the wizarding world grew fearful and quiet, and even a family that kept its head down could not help but feel the weight of it. The Dark Lord's power had spread far, and his followers moved through the country like a cold wind, and there were mornings when the newspaper that arrived by owl carried names that Severus and Lily had once known, now written in the black borders, reserved for the lost. They grieved those names in private, as gentle people do, but they did not let the grief pull them under. They had made their choice long ago, in the days when Severus had stepped away from the rising circle of Death Eaters before he had ever truly joined it. They had chosen to survive, to keep their love and their home and their child safe, rather than to be swept into the fire. And they held to that choice with a quiet steadiness through all the dark years. They helped where they could, from the shadows, offering knowledge and shelter to those who fought openly. But they did not go looking for the war. And by some grace, the war did not come looking for them. And then, one night that seemed at first no different from any other, the war ended. It ended far away from their fireside, in a place none of them had ever seen, and they learned of it the way most of the world learned of it, slowly, in fragments, as rumor turned to whisper, and whisper turned at last to certain news. The Dark Lord had fallen. The name that men had feared to speak aloud was suddenly, impossibly, a thing of the past. It seemed almost too large to be believed, and for a while, nobody quite dared to believe it. The truth of how he fell reached them only in pieces, as such truths always do. He had gone, they heard, to a house in a quiet village, meaning to end a threat before it could grow. He had struck at a child, and in the striking his own terrible power had turned against him, undone by something older and deeper than any dark art he had ever mastered. A mother's love, some said. A protection freely given and paid for in full had turned his curse back upon himself and scattered him to nothing. The world did not fully understand it, and perhaps it was not meant to be understood, only received, the way one receives a sunrise after a very long night. Severus heard the news and sat very still for a long while, his hand resting on the arm of his chair, his eyes fixed on the low fire. He thought of the world he had once been tempted to join, the cold company of men who had believed that power was the only thing worth having, and he thought of how close he had come, in the loneliness of his youth, to walking that road himself. He might have been among them, in another telling of his life. He might have been one of the names now spoken with fear and loathing, or one of the names written in black borders. Instead, he sat by his own hearth, a free man with a clean conscience, and the Dark Lord who might have claimed him was gone, undone by the very thing Severus had chosen over power all those years ago. Love had ended the war. Love, he understood now, had also saved him long before the war ever ended. Lily came and sat beside him, and she took his hand, and for a long time neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying. She understood better than anyone what the news meant to him. She had been the one, in the gray years of their youth, who had drawn him gently away from the darkness, who had shown him, without ever preaching it, that kindness was not weakness, and that there was another way to live. She had given him, in her quiet, steady friendship, the same gift that had, in the end, undone the Dark Lord himself. A love freely given, asking nothing, changing everything. She had not known, in those early days, how much would turn upon it. Perhaps no one ever knows. In the days that followed, the wider world began, slowly, to come out from under its long fear. There were celebrations in the streets of the wizarding towns, owls flying by daylight, in numbers not seen for years, strangers embracing strangers in the sudden lightness of a danger lifted. Severus and Lily watched it all from a small distance, as they had watched so much of the war, neither swept up in the joy nor apart from it. They were glad, deeply and quietly glad, but their gladness was tempered by all they had seen and lost, and by the knowledge of how narrow the margin had been between one life and another. They spoke of it very little, and only softly, in the low hours after the child had gone to sleep. There were friends they would not see again, faces that belonged now only to memory, and it did not feel right to celebrate too loudly over their graves. And yet beneath the sorrow there ran a current of something that was not quite joy and not quite relief, but a deep and steadying gratitude. They had come through. Against every dark year and every shadow that had crossed their door, they had come through together, and the world their child would inherit would be a kinder one than the world they had known. That was worth more to them than any celebration in any street. Mostly, they were grateful. They looked at their child, sleeping soundly through the great turning of the world, untouched by the terror that had gripped everyone else, and they understood that this was the true measure of what they had built. Their family had survived the war hole, not by hiding behind walls of power, and not by throwing themselves into the fire, but by choosing again and again across the long years, love over fear. Every gentle turning had led them here, to this fireside, on the night the shadow finally lifted from the world. The boy who had once been tempted toward darkness had raised a child who would grow up in a world washed clean of the very thing he had refused. There was a rightness to it that neither of them could have put into words. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to a soft red glow, Severus stood in the doorway of the child's room and watched the small breathing shape beneath the blankets. He thought of the mother, whoever she had been, in that faraway house, who had given everything so that her own child might live, and whose love had, in the giving, freed a whole world from its fear. He did not know her name, and he never would, but he felt toward her a deep and silent kinship. She had chosen love in the last hour, as he had chosen it in his youth. Two choices, made in different lives, running toward the same quiet truth. He bowed his head in the darkened doorway, and he was grateful, and he did not try to say why. Outside, the long war was over. The world would rebuild itself now, slowly, house by house and heart by heart, learning again how to live without fear. And in one small home between the Muggle lanes and the hidden magical world, a family that had chosen survival over glory slept soundly through the first peaceful night in a very long time. The danger had passed them by, as they had always hoped it would. What remained was only the ordinary business of living and loving and growing older together in a world grown safe at last. Up next in Chapter 19, Old Wounds Healed, we will follow the slow mending of the griefs that Severus had carried since his youth, the quiet dissolving of the old bitterness, and the way a life built on gentleness can reach back and soften even the oldest and coldest of sorrows. With the war ended and the world grown quiet, there came into the little house a kind of peace that ran deeper than the peace of any single evening. It was the slow, settling peace of a life that has found its shape, and in that peace, the old wounds that Severus had carried since his boyhood began, at last, to heal. They did not vanish all at once. Wounds so old do not vanish, but they softened and grew quiet and became at length only faint marks that a man could look upon without pain, the way an old scar can be traced with a fingertip and felt as nothing more than a memory. Severus had carried a great deal from his early years. He had grown up in a cold house in Cokeworth, in the shadow of a marriage that had gone wrong, among sharp words and long silences. He had been a strange, unhappy boy, mocked for his shabby clothes and his hooked nose and his hungry cleverness, and he had learned young to guard himself, to expect little, to meet the world with a scowl before the world could wound him first. Those habits had cut deep grooves into his heart, and for many years it had seemed they would never be worn smooth. Yet they were being worn smooth now, slowly, by the steady water of an ordinary happy life. It was Lily who had begun the mending, of course, long before either of them understood what was happening. In the days of their youth, when the friendship might so easily have broken on a single cruel word, she had chosen understanding over anger, and sorrow over pride. And in that choosing, she had kept open the one door through which all his later healing would eventually come. She had never tried to remake him. She had only loved him as he was, patiently and without conditions, and that love had done what no lecture and no punishment could ever have done. It had shown him, over years and years, that he was worthy of being loved. And a man who truly believes himself worthy of love is a man whose oldest wounds have already half closed. The child helped too, in ways that Severus had never anticipated. There is a particular healing that comes to a wounded person from caring for someone smaller and more fragile than themselves. In teaching his child to be unafraid, Severus found some of his own fear quietly leaving him. In showing his child that the world was a gentle place, he began, at last, to half believe it himself. Every night he tucked a warm blanket around a small sleeping shape. He was, without quite knowing it, tucking a blanket around the cold and frightened boy he had once been. The care he gave flowed backward through the years as well as forward, and it reached the places in him that had gone unwarmed for so long. There was a day, in those peaceful years, when Severus returned for the first time in a great while to Cokeworth, to the grey mill town where it had all begun. He walked the old streets slowly, Lily at his side, and he found that the place had lost much of its power to hurt him. The river was still there, the same river where two lonely children had once sat and traded secrets, and where a strange boy had first told a bright girl that she was a witch. The water still moved the way it always had, patient and unhurried, carrying the gray light of the sky along its surface. Severus stood on the bank a long while and remembered the boy he had been. And instead of the old bitterness, he felt only a quiet, forgiving sorrow, the tenderness one feels toward a child who suffered and did not deserve to. He forgave that boy at last. He had spent so many years being ashamed of him, and now, standing by the river with his oldest friend beside him, he simply let the shame go. The old rivalries, too, had long since faded into nothing. In another telling of his life, Severus might have carried a lifelong hatred for James Potter and the friends who had tormented him, might have let that hatred curdle inside him and shape everything he became. But in this life, the rivalry had simply been left to cool, the way an old fire cools when no one feeds it, until nothing remained but a little cold ash that no longer mattered. Lily had turned her heart not toward James, but toward the friend who had always been there, and so the old wound of jealousy had never had the chance to deepen. Severus found, when he thought of those boys now, that he could think of them almost kindly, as figures from a distant story that had ended long ago and turned out well after all. Lily watched the change in him across the years with a deep and grateful tenderness. She had always known there was gentleness in him, buried beneath the guardedness and the sharp defensive wit. She had glimpsed it in their childhood, in the way he had shared his few small treasures with her, in the way his fierce cleverness had softened whenever it turned toward her. To watch that gentleness rise slowly to the surface and become, at last, the whole man was the great quiet joy of her life. She had not saved him, exactly. He had saved himself, choice by choice, turning by turning. But she had walked beside him the whole way, and she had believed in the man he could become long before he believed in himself. And that belief had been a lantern held steady through all his darkest passages. There was a further healing, too, that came from the simple passage of ordinary time. Grief and old hurt do not answer well to force, but they yield slowly to gentleness repeated day after day after day. Every quiet breakfast, every shared task, every night spent safe beneath the same roof laid one more thin layer of peace over the old wounds, until the wounds were buried so deep beneath so much good living that they could no longer reach the surface. Severus did not wake in the night anymore with the old cold dread. He woke, when he woke at all, to the sound of a familiar breathing beside him, and he would lie still in the dark and feel, quite simply, that he was home. There were evenings, in those healed years, when the two of them would sit together by the fire and speak, very softly, of all that had passed. They would remember the gray town and the cold houses and the long loneliness of two children who had each thought themselves alone. They would remember the turning point, the word that was never said, the friendship kept where it might so easily have been lost. And they would marvel, gently, at how far the road had carried them from those beginnings to this warm room, this quiet peace, this life that had mended everything that had once been broken. It seemed to both of them a kind of small miracle, though it had been made not of miracles, but of choices. 1,000 small kindnesses laid patiently one upon another until they built a whole and happy life. Severus was a different man now than the boy of Cokeworth, and yet he was also, in the deepest way, the same. The cleverness remained, and the fierce loyalty, and the capacity for a love so total that it could reshape a life. What had changed was only that the fear had gone, and the bitterness, and the terrible certainty that he was meant to be alone. Those old wounds had healed, not because he had forgotten them, but because he had been loved long enough and steadily enough that they no longer had the power to define him. He was whole. He had been made whole not by magic, though he was a great master of magic, but by the plainest and oldest healing there is, the slow, patient work of a love that does not give up. Up next in Chapter 20, The Life They Never Had, we will draw the whole of the story together. Two children of a gray town who kept their friendship, chose each other, and built against every odd a quiet and ordinary happiness. And we will close, softly, on a warm home and a night made for rest. And so we come, gently, to the whole of it, the long and quiet story of a life that might so easily never have been. Two children of a gray mill town, Severus Snape and Lily Evans, met one summer by a slow river and found in each other the thing that each of them had most needed and least expected, someone who understood. That was the beginning, and everything that followed grew from it, patiently, over many years. The way a great tree grows from a single seed, dropped almost by accident into good soil. There had been a moment, once, when it might all have broken. A single cruel word had hung in the air between them, ready to be said, and in another telling of the world it was said, and the friendship shattered, and two lives spun off into loneliness and loss. But in this telling the word was never spoken, or was met at once with sorrow and with forgiveness, and the friendship held. Everything turned upon that one small mercy. A whole life, a whole family, a whole quiet happiness, all of it balanced upon a single moment when kindness was chosen over pride. It is a strange and gentle truth that the largest things so often rest upon the smallest, that a life can be saved by a word left unsaid or a hand held out at the right moment. From that kept friendship, everything unfolded. The sorting divided them, one to Slytherin and one to Gryffindor, two houses and two worlds within the same castle, and still the bond did not break. Severus came to a crossroads in his youth, drawn toward the dark company and the cold ideas of blood purity, tempted by the promise of power and belonging that is so sweet to a lonely heart. And there, at the crossroads, stood Lily, not preaching, not scolding, only being good, only being steadily and warmly herself. A light he could not bring himself to turn away from. For love of her, he turned away from the dark instead. He left the rising circle of the Death Eaters before he had ever truly joined it, and in that hardest and most important choice of his life, he saved his own soul from being lost. The old rivalry with the Marauders was left simply to cool, untended, and forgotten, and Lily's heart turned not toward James, but toward the friend who had always been there. What had been friendship deepened, slowly and surely, into love, unhurried and built on years of understanding rather than any sudden passion. There was a small and tender wedding that neither of them had ever quite expected. Two outsiders at last finding a home in each other. And then there was the home itself, a house of books and potions between the Muggle lanes and the hidden magical world, full of quiet scholarship and gentle domesticity, where cauldrons simmered and charms warmed the air, and the light came golden through bright curtains. They lived through a dark war and chose to survive it, neither serving the Dark Lord nor throwing themselves into martyrdom, keeping their heads down and their love safe. They aided the Order of the Phoenix quietly from the shadows, offering knowledge and shelter without being consumed by the fire. And through all of it, the bitter and guarded boy from Cokeworth grew slowly into a steadier, kinder man, his sharp edges worn smooth by a life of being loved and choosing love in return. A child came to them, filling the house with small clutter and bright questions, raised in warmth and learning by two parents who had each once feared they would always be alone. The war ended far away, the Dark Lord undone by a love as freely given as the love that had saved Severus himself, and the family survived it whole. And the old wounds of Severus's youth, carried so long, healed at last in the slow, patient water of an ordinary happy life. It is worth pausing, at the last, to notice how quietly all of it was made. There was no single grand moment that turned the story, no thunderclap of destiny that set everything right. There was only a long series of small and gentle choices, each one made freely, each one made in favor of love. A word held back, a hand held out, a path refused, a friend believed in, a child cherished, a wound forgiven. Any one of these, taken alone, would have seemed too small to matter, and yet together they were everything. For it is out of exactly such small things that whole lives are built. And the difference between a story of sorrow and a story of peace can rest upon choices no larger than these. That is the shape of it, the whole gentle arc. From two lonely children by a river to a warm and healed and quiet home. It was never a grand story. There were no great battles won within these walls, no thrones taken, no legends made that the wider world would ever sing. It was only a life, an ordinary human life, lived kindly and well. And yet, held up to the light, it shines with a quiet worth that all the grand stories lack, because it was built entirely of the things that truly matter, of friendship kept, of love chosen, of gentleness offered again and again until it became the whole shape of two lives. Picture them now, in the later years, grown older together in that same warm house. The fire burns low on the hearth, as it always has. Severus sits in his chair, with a book open on his knee, though his eyes have drifted from the page toward the window and the soft dark beyond it. Lily is near him, as she has been near him through all the long years, and the quiet between them is full and easy, the quiet of two people who have said everything worth saying and no longer need words to say it. Somewhere in the house their child is grown now, and safe, and loved, carrying forward into the world all the warmth that was poured so freely into this home. The night is calm. The danger is long past. There is nothing left to fear and nothing left to solve. This is the life they never had, in the true and sorrowful telling of things, the life that was lost to a single cruel word. But here, in this gentle what if, they had it after all. They had every ordinary day of it, every shared breakfast and every quiet evening, every small kindness and every long companionable silence. They had the friendship and the courtship, and the wedding and the child. They had the healing and the peace. They had, in the end, the plainest and rarest of all treasures, a long and quiet happiness, held on to against every odd, from a gray beginning to a warm and restful end. And now the story lets them go, softly, as all stories must. The fire settles. The house grows still. The two children of Cokeworth, grown old and content, rest at last in the home they built together out of nothing but choices and kindness and time. There is no more road to walk tonight, no more choice to make, no more wound to heal. There is only the warm dark and the low glow of the embers, and the deep and settled peace of a life fully and gently lived. Let that peace be yours as well, now, in this quiet room where you are lying. Let the story sink away from you like the last warmth of a fire banked for the night, growing fainter and softer until only calm remains. You do not need to hold on to any of it. You do not need to remember the river, or the word never said, or the warm house at the end of the long road. Let it all dissolve, gently, into the dark. You are safe, and you are warm, and there is nothing at all that asks anything of you now. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day drift away like mist over still water, and let yourself sink, softly and completely, down into rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight, we followed two children of Cokeworth, a word that was never said, and a friendship that held through the years. We watched a sorting that divided them, and a bond that did not break, Severus at a crossroads, and Lily's steady light. We saw him turn away from the dark, leave the Death Eaters behind before he was ever truly lost, and the old rivalry of the Marauders simply left to cool. We followed a quiet courtship, a wedding neither expected, a home of books and potions, and a war they chose to survive. We watched them stand apart from Voldemort, aid the Order from the shadows, and a bitter boy gentled at last by love. And we came, at the end, to children of their own, the Dark Lord's fall seen from afar, old wounds healed, and the life they never had, now fully lived. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those bright and difficult things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet valley. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us. There are many more long, gentle tales waiting for the nights to come.